Hello, friends, and welcome back to a bonus episode of the Jank Tank. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I will be hosting this episode for you all, and we've got the Bakersbane duo in the house. We've got Teld on the line with me here to talk some Peasant Cube, but we also have a guest with us. We have Daneelius, also aka known as Dan, with us to kind of make up for a lost episode we did not so many weeks ago, about a month ago maybe now. Dan, we had kind of a great episode where we sat down and talked about Peasant Cube, and we talked about the objectification of Peasant Cube, and the prevalence of like rectangle theory and things like that. But due to some audio issues in the background, we weren't able to actually go through with that final recording. So it is nice to have you back on the show with us, and I hope you're excited to talk about foundations and some Peasant Cube action with us today. Good to have you here, though. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Very sad about losing that episode. It was a good one, but maybe we'll be able to re-record it here sometime soon.
Yeah, at some point. I mean, we've actually got a lot of rectangle cards, or whatever you want to call them, here today. So it'll come up like incidentally as well. Teld, how you doing this morning?
Yeah, I'm feeling all right. It's been a stressful year, so, it's been nice to have a long weekend. Went and hung out with my friends for my birthday, and so, it's been a pleasant weekend.
Oh, yeah, tomorrow's a holiday, isn't it? So we are going to talk about foundations. By the time you're listening to this, we will have already posted our mainline review with myself, Teld, and Chris concerning some of the higher power level stuff from foundations, where we actually found a decent amount to talk about. The Peasant Cube has even more than I anticipated. I said in that mainline review that I wasn't a huge fan of foundations. I didn't really think the set was for us, but there's still plenty of cubable cards worth talking about. For this bonus episode, I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about mechanics or, set logistics or anything like that. If you want kind of our breakdown and initial impressions on the set, I suggest going and checking out the mainline cube episode, which I think is episode number 32. So here we're going to try and get into the gist of it. I did want to mention Daneelius operates a different cube than the Jank Diver Game and Peasant Cube, right? You said you changed the name last time. It's not the Fire Design Cube anymore. Can you remind me what the name of that cube is?
Oh yeah, the branding
the working name.
The branding is way worse than it used to be. It's the Extended Peasant All-Stars Cube. I might go back to Fire Cube at some point, but there's a whole backstory not worth getting into now.
Yeah. We talked about it a little extensively on that Lost episode, but the basic gist of it is it's a 540 cube. It's really looking at, as the old name would imply, top contenders in limited formats, right? Kind of like limited all-stars over the last X number of years, kind of mashed together. It's a 540. It's focused more on tempo, low curves, quick games, quick interactions, things like that. And you've got a preference towards these kind of rectangle theory style cards. So there's a little bit of a difference in the way that Daneelius will be evaluating cards versus the way Teld and I will be evaluating cards for our own Peasant Cube. But overall, I think we're going to keep it kind of like high level on the same page and not necessarily like cube specific. So there will be times where we mention, in this cube, this card will have a certain type of role, but may not have the same kind of role in, say, Daneelius's cube. Also wanted to just plug the I believe it's the Court of Calls Discord, right, is where Daneelius is kind of moderating. Is that right? You said the Court of Calls, not going optimal. What is it? The
limited
level ups. That's it, right?
Limited level ups.
Yeah. So if you want to get Daneelius's opinions on more peasant-related content, either come find him in our Discord, in the Jank Diver Gaming Discord, or go join the Limited Level Ups Discord, which is Alex
Nikolic, yep. We just say Court of Calls, yeah.
Yeah, better known on the internet as Court of Calls. Go join that Discord as well, especially if you're into limited content. Alex, Court of Calls is one of the big limited minds right now, kind of pushing content and stuff like that, and I really respect his opinion about a lot of stuff. And I suppose you guys talk about Cube over there a decent amount as well. So if not, Jank Diver Gaming Discord's always a good place for that sort of thing.
Great place to have opinions.
we're a great place to have opinions. Yeah. Before we get into this, I did want to mention like our labeling system. Instead of giving things a grade like A through F or whatever, we do generally put labels on a lot of different cards. I got a little lazy with it this time. I've been preoccupied with a lot of stuff to the point where I didn't necessarily put a label on a lot of these different cards, but I will be sure to mention a label here and there if I think it's like important to the card. So this is things like, what is the purpose of a card in a cube if you were to add it to a cube? Things like, it's just a role player, it's an archetypal card, it's a test card that we're not sure how it's going to play out, things like that. And then there are a couple flags, like a red flag card would be a card that we think is, hold on, this is probably too good for a peasant environment, or a strict upgrade, that's just a pretty easy label to put on something. It's like, this is replacing another card because it's just doing exactly what that card does, but better in some way. So, again, a little bit lazy with the labels this time around to the point where I might not mention them for a lot of cards, but I'll do better about that in the future. I did want to mention before we get into actual individual card by card discussion here, do you guys have like strong opinions about Foundations at this point in terms of like just overall set? Like, excitement level, individual card excitement level, like where are you guys at on Foundations going, coming off of like pre-release weekend?
Yeah, I have a strong opinion that I'm ready for whatever comes after it.
Yeah, I think that for a core set, this is very obviously a core set, this is totally fine. I actually tend to enjoy core set limited, and I don't really have an opinion on this for constructed or anything else, but for limited, I tend to enjoy core sets in small doses. I think this will be a solid core set limited environment. I think there's some choices that they made that are really perplexing, honestly, just from a power level perspective. I don't get some of the design choices they made, even if they're trying to target this at a newer audience. But I think it'll be a fun environment to draft 10 to 20 times, and then I'll probably go back to playing the Bazaar until either Drift or whatever it's called set comes out next.
Yeah, we're in the long run here. I think Ether Drift comes out in like February, and this set is releasing beginning of November. So we do get Pioneer Masters next month though, so there's a little something to talk about for the arena players. My excitement level, especially I'm coming off of the back of a 7-1 pre-release record, and I can't say like my matches were incredibly fun or anything like that. I mean, it's a core set. I view core sets as palette cleansers. I always have, and I've not been a huge fan of them. Like, I like to do them for like 5 drafts, and then it just becomes really clear like what the best 2 color pairs are, and then everybody's just like jockeying for the 2 color pairs. And they're simple things. It's like black white life gain. Like, you're not really doing anything like super crazy. You're not experimenting in the format or anything like that. So I don't think this format has like really, like long-term legs or anything like that, but for what it's offering, and especially for the new player experience, I'm like, okay, like I'm cool with this existing. I will probably draft it until the next set comes out and be fine with it, but I'm not excited. That said, we get to talk about Cube instead of talking about the retail limited, so that adds a little bit more excitement to these cards than they would otherwise have. And Dan, you had a good suggestion of kind of filter in the reprints towards the end of the episode, which is what we did in case people are like, I don't really want to listen to them talk about Vampire Nighthawk 15 years after Vampire Nighthawk comes out. Like, everybody kind of knows how good or not good it is. So if you don't really care much about the reprints coming out here and you only care about the new cards, we will be fronting all of that up front. So with all that being said, I feel like I'm blathering at this point. I feel like I'm just kind of rambling a little bit. Do we want to get into some single card discussion here? We start off with white.
Let's go.
This one's actually just a quick mention and move on with our lives. But we will start off with Helpful Hunter, 1 and a white for a 1/1 common cat, and when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. I mean, people go gaga over cards like this. I just wanted to mention it as a redundant version of Spirited Companion, the dog that does the same thing. But as Daneelius pointed out in our notes, Spirited Companion's an enchantment creature, so it probably just has like more synergy, but I know there are enough people out there who just love these cantrip creatures that I'm going to mention the cat that does the same thing, and is probably worse because it just has fewer synergies than Spirited Companion.
Yeah, I think this is like approaching strictly worse Split Skin Doll / Spirited Companion, and I think that's all there really is to say about it. If you're looking for a technically cleaner text box because you don't have to worry about enchantment synergies, you could play this, but I don't see much reason to include this.
No, it's same thing I said with Pond Prophet in what was that Bloomburrow? It's like people love these 2-mana 1/1 cantrip creatures, and I'm like, okay, there's so many of them, you just don't have to play all of them. But if you are looking for cats or you're looking for more cantrip creatures, like Helpful Hunter's fine. But I wanted to mention that because people out there love this sort of card. But we do get to transition directly into a much more exciting card. In my opinion, like the best uncommon to come out of the mainline set for Peasant Cube. I'm not sure if you guys agree with that or not, but we'll move on to Sun Blessed Healer. 1 and a white for a 3/1 uncommon human cleric. It has kicker for 1 and a white. It has lifelink. And when it enters, if you kicked it, you return a non-land permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This card's just awesome, right? The baseline of a 2-mana 3/1 lifelink is already like acceptable, and then you just get to attack on 2 mana to bring back a 1-drop or a 2-drop from your graveyard. Like, I mean, what are you trying to bring back, I guess, is the question. Like, what are you excited to bring back? The card's just kind of good as a 2-drop, and then as a 4-drop, it's excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aiming to bring back an Archfiend's Vessel personally, but there's a lot you can do with this, and one of the things I really like about this is we've discussed how blue-white in our cube has moved away from being a blink deck because of the way cards have panned out. We didn't like having the way Soul Herder warped games, and we've been talking about potentially making it more of an artifact enchantment sort of synergy deck, and these are the kind of cards that can bridge that, right? This is good in basically every deck. It'll be good. But it's the kind of card that a lot of times, I think in the past, we saw stuff like Phyrexian Missionary, I believe, that you had to do a different color of mana to kick it. It didn't return it to play. But also it could only pick up creatures. And so this is just awesome. I love these designs. I love being able to, get cards back out of the graveyard. I think this fits like a number of decks. It'll be particularly good in our black-white deck and probably like our green-white deck. Maybe not that one. That one does tend to run a little more spells. But this is just a generically super powerful card, and we talked about potentially running it in the main cube, and I think we passed on it. But the fact that we were discussing a uncommon creature was just kind of a testament to how powerful this card is.
Mm-hmm. Daneelius, what are your thoughts on Sun Blessed Healer?
I think it's obviously fantastic. The first card that came to mind when I saw it is a pet card in my cube. Well, it's apparently a pet card because I know a lot of other people don't run it, which is Citizen's Crowbar. I love the idea of getting to use Crowbar to kill something, then bring it back. But just in general, the number of combos with this card, I think, is actually pretty substantial. One of the things I noted immediately with it is the fact that it can bring back sagas, the 2-mana sagas specifically, like Witch's Vanity or Welcome to Sweet Tooth. Yeah. I think this card's incredible. And the body isn't awful, like 3/1 lifelink. I do think 3/1 in general is better than 2/2, even in Cube, which has access to plenty of 1/1s lying around. I still like having the upside of a high power lifelink creature. So yeah, this card is busted. It's immediately, I think, one of White's better cards. To me, what the interesting thing to think about is whether you're running this as a 2-drop or a 4-drop. For me, I'm going to be thinking of it as a 4-drop because I think that more often that's what you're going to be casting it as. But that's just something to think about if you're a cube curator and you're trying to decide where this slots in. I do think on average you're going to be spending 4 mana on this card.
Yeah, and this just plays perfectly into that whole like objectification thing, right? Where like the more you specialize effects into permanents instead of like instants and sorceries, the more cards like this flourish. You're bringing back like an unsummon or something in the form of a permanent rather than not being able to do so because you're playing actual unsummon or Fate and Hope or something like that. So I would refer to a different episode for you to listen more about that, but we don't have it, unfortunately.
And for the first time of what's sure to be the only time I say it this episode, what's a permanent that costs 2 mana?
Yeah, I know.
That's a good synergy with this card.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you want to just get it out of the way?
I'm gonna save saying the name, that way I can keep teasing it until I really want to use it. I can't say it 53 times an episode.
Yeah, of course not. Daneelius, do you want to go ahead and read the next card for us? Because I know this is really high on your list of includes from the set.
Yep. Really quickly, one other card I forgot to mention on Sunblessed Healer is Essence Reliquary, which was a card we talked about quite a lot in the last episode. That's returning this to hand is a quite powerful upgrade to just blinking this with something like Soul Herder, because obviously is what's necessary there. So, but
Essence Reliquary is also just like generically good with modal stuff, right? Like MDFCs and things like this, because you can just run it out on 2 and then later on pick it up.
Yep.
It makes you not feel bad about losing out on the kicker earlier if you have an open in hand that's like Sunblessed Healer plus Reliquary.
Absolutely, and definitely.
Yeah, one last thing is notably if you run some of the cards that, I don't know if we have any of them, none that jump to mind, but stuff like Executioner's Capsule, where you've got a removal spell that you can put into the graveyard. This card's obviously great with those because those tend to be a pretty good deal. And just in general, cheap permanents that have some sort of more expensive activated ability that puts them into the graveyard will play well with this as just like a way of really grinding out games.
Absolutely. Okay, take the Cat Collector for us.
Yep. All right. So we got Cat Collector here. This is 2 and a white for a 3/2 human citizen uncommon. When this creature enters, create a food token. My favorite line of text in Peasant. And then we have whenever you gain life for the first time during each of your turns, create a 1/1 white cat creature token. I put in the show notes that this is, I think, my favorite card of 2024. I'm not saying it's the best card of 2024, but the specific thing that this is doing that really important is it's, I think, pretty clearly White's best life gain payoff now in Peasant. This is across all possible cubes. Obviously, people have their affinity for a Johnny's Pridemate.
They do.
With apologies to Johnny's Pridemate, I think this is significantly better as a payoff card specifically for that archetype. But the fact that it gets to be a payoff card that on its own is doing so much. It's making 2 permanents. It's giving you a token, an artifact. Again, the last episode, we got all into this about why I'm so interested in these sorts of cards. But also, it gives itself that first 1/1 potentially. You can play this on 5 mana, and it's it's not amazing as a 3/2 and a 1/1 and a gain 3 life for 5 mana. But that's not embarrassing either. Just giving you access to more things to do with your mana. So yeah, I think it works well in white-red with Kenzen Smelter, obviously with Rosie, just making extra tokens for things. So I think this card is both really strong and also really interesting for cube curators to try to push very light life gain synergies. You don't have to seed an entire archetype into your cube. You can just put this card in because it's going to go into lots of different decks. But sometimes your drafters are going to see this in their first few packs. They're going to take it and they're going to push a little bit into that life gain space without having to devote cards that are a lot more narrow, like a Johnny's Pridemate, to your cube. So absolutely love this card. Really excited for it.
Yeah, pretty similar feelings for me. A couple of notable things with this card, like we do run Lunarch Veteran, for example, in our cube, and we don't run it as a life gain card. It's just like kind of a generically fine 1-drop, and if you get these 2 cards going, it's a little engine. It can even get your token on curve, which is really cool. You like play the Lunarch Veteran, and then on turn 3 you play this, you immediately get a 1/1, and that's a great deal. Additionally, there's stuff like Sheltered by Ghost that gives creatures lifelink that could guarantee you getting a 1/1 every turn. Obviously good with like Blood Artist effects, where you're draining your opponent and generating 1/1s that then give you future fuel to use those Blood Artists. So a lot of little micro synergies that this card enables without, like you said, without needing a dedicated life gain deck. And it's self-enabling. So great card. Really like this one.
Another card I would shout out, like in addition to Soul Sisters, and any card that triggers on death, especially if it gives you access to a sacrifice outlet. So Denethor is a card that I'm really excited with this. That's a card that I run in my cube, which again, I would recommend to people give a shot if they haven't before. Some people run Hidden Stockpile as a similar sort of card, but I do think that Denethor has some real advantages over Hidden Stockpile. But Denethor being able to sacrifice creatures to then gain life means you just have this infinite engine going, at least once a turn, infinite engine. But that's a synergy I'm looking to exploit.
Yeah, there should be some cool stuff going on there. Go ahead and read the next card for us as well, because this is one that I didn't really peg as like super exciting to talk about, but you added it to the list here, and I think like it gets there on rate. It's just not like there's nothing like, ooh, look at this card. It's just kind of like a decent little card.
Excitement's always in the eye of the beholder.
True.
This is Dawnwing Marshal. This is 1 and a white for a 2/2 cat soldier, uncommon, has flying, and 4 and a white. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. So really the key thing about this card is it's just the first 2 mana 2/2 white flyer. That's the main thing that I see about this that makes it intriguing on its own. That would be enough to at least, have you perk up a little bit. Now, I don't think that would be good enough to run it in Cube these days. And so then the question is, how much does the ability add to the card? And I think it adds a fair amount. The best one of the better one drops in our cube, that at least by our estimation, is Steadfast Unicorn. Now the pump ability on Unicorn is significantly better than this, obviously, but having access to that sort of effect makes this a playable card in more than just white blue flyers, or white blue tempo, or even white red tempo. The fact that you can play this in go wide decks or flyers decks, I do think makes it at least a card that people are going to see and be more interested in than they otherwise would be for a more generic 2-mana 2/2 flyer. So the main reason why I think it's worth talking about is just the rate. We haven't seen it before. I think that's important to note. I don't know that I would add this to my cube even if it was part of my card pool, but I think it's definitely worth consideration.
Yeah, this is a card that it didn't stick out to me either, but I mean, it is a cheap, evasive, reasonably statted creature that works well in, like, it'd be fine in green white, fine in red white, like probably fine in black white in our cube. So I mean, there's and if we ever switch, like I said, if we ever do that change where we talked about making blue white more of like an artifact enchantment deck, I could see this being a great place to put your sort of aura enchantments, your pump spell type enchantments, if you run those. So I see this card being good. It doesn't really perk me up and excite me, but it is definitely on rate, and it's one of the better versions of this pay 5, because usually this is on like a pretty understated creature. I think we've seen it on like a 1-mana 1/2 and a 2-mana 1/2 flyer before, but we haven't really seen it on a card that you're just kind of happy to play out on turn 2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, compare it to the Warden from Bloomburrow, which is just a vanilla 2-mana 2/2. I believe that one costs 4 mana to give everything +1/+1, but slap flying on that bad boy, make the activated ability a little bit more expensive, and like suddenly it's like, oh, okay, there's something interesting going on here. So there's nothing flashy about Dawnwing Marshal at all, but I do think the entire package comes together as a nice little aggressive card, also a decent little go wide card. Does pump itself, right? Yeah, it pumps itself as well when you activate the ability, so that's kind of nice too.
Yeah, I also think it's generally better to have these abilities be just a little more expensive, because by the time you're ready to activate it, you kind of want to have played out all the spells in your hand anyways, so you don't usually care all that much whether it's 4 mana or 5.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that really affects is when you hit that 8 mana and you can't like double activate, which did happen in like Bloomburrow Limited with the rabbit, but you're not getting to 10 mana usually to double activate. But +1/+1, even for like 4, 5, 6 mana does change combat. Mana sinks are nice as well, and when you tack a mana sink onto a card that's already a good like stat creature for its cost, like you'll just take whatever upside they give you on that.
One thing to remember with this card is we're about to spoil a card, or talk about a card here soon, that this works particularly well with, that might be spitting out a bunch of 1/1 flying tokens. It has me considering the synergies, but sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, just remembering these cards, the threat of activation is often enough to change the way your opponent will block, and so once you're at 5 mana, this card opens up attacks even if you don't have to commit the mana to spending 5 on it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we get to talk about a 6-drop in white, which is not something we talk about too often. Actually, we talked about the Fear of Abduction in Duskmourn, but I think that one ultimately is not been that good. But I think that this one's like an obviously strong card. So Guarded Air is 5 and a white for a 1/1 uncommon human noble with lifelink. When it enters, create 2 3/3 white knight creature tokens. So 6 mana for a 1/1 lifelink, which I don't know why they threw the lifelink in, but it also makes 2 3/3 tokens, so 7 power, 7 toughness across 3 bodies for 6 mana. And importantly, kind of the reason we talk about this one is the body is attached to the thing that's making the tokens. So obviously, like, your mind immediately jumps to recursion and blink and things like that. If you ever blink this once, you've just like probably won the game. It's kind of like you cast Rise of the Ants twice, I guess the conversation I want to have here is, how does this stack up to Imperial Oath, which is the 6 mana sorcery, create 3 2/2s and scry 2. I think they have vigilance, 3 2/2 vigilance creatures and scry 2. And I'm not clear, like, in a vacuum which one of those I like. I think it's going to come down to like which synergies you have with the cards, but I'm curious what you guys think of that comparison, and maybe just this card on its own. You just slap this on the board for 6 mana. How happy are you with it?
Yeah, I think it's pretty decent. I mean, 2/3/3s, and the one with lifelink seems kind of silly, but like one of the things that is notable about that is that it makes you extremely unlikely to die the turn you cast it. I'm not going to say you're never going to die there, right? But you know, if you block like a 5/5 or a 4/4 or whatever and gain a life, like you gain 5 life functionally. And you know, you get to put it in the graveyard so that you can potentially reanimate or recur it or whatever. Obviously, all the synergies it's got going on, White's really good at bumping stat lines. So you put like a Bone Splitter on this, or you put a couple of +1 counters on this, and the lifelink starts to really matter. Obviously, there's, you know, stuff with like Essence Reliquary and all that, the kind of stuff we regularly talk about that this card is good with. I think it's just totally fine on rate, and I'm not actually sure it's even competing with Imperial Oath, because I'm not convinced that every white deck doesn't want one of these at the top of your curve, and you're probably going to have 2 white decks at a table. And so I think, like, I don't think one white deck would necessarily want both Imperial Oath and Guarded Air, but I could see 2 different white decks each wanting one of these effect as a way of like having some top end. And I agree with you that the fear ended up playing out much worse than we speculated that it could. It kind of ended up being more of the downsides we talked about showed up more than the potential upsides we were highlighting.
Yeah, I think that. So the only place I disagree there is I do think it's probably, at least for me, going to be competing with Imperial Oath, and that's largely because I don't really see either of these cards as being good top end for an aggressive strategy, and the majority of my white decks are aggressive. Now, I do definitely support a more attrition-based white deck, but that deck I don't think is going to really want 2 of these effects. And so for me, I think it's going to be an either-or situation. One thing I wanted to call out is that I'm a part of a couple other Cube communities, and one of them mentioned that for them, the aggro decks, especially the go wide aggro decks, where this would theoretically be at its best, you know, as a defensive player, as a stabilizing play, those decks tend to be more based on flyers, so things like Battle Screech, and this doesn't really stabilize very well against there. It doesn't even stabilize as well as, say, a Rise of the Ants, which I do think this card kind of compares pretty similarly with, because at least Rise of the Ants gives you a little bit of life gain. So I agree with what was said before about the synergy piece here. You know, are you pushing instants and sorceries at all in your white section, or are you pushing permanents? I'm pushing permanents, and so I think that this is going to make more sense. But it's tough for me because I will say that Imperial Oath plus Wrath, the white-blue uncommon legend, was kind of a little package that allowed white to play a little bit more in that instants and sorcery space. You know, you can play Imperial Oath and return it from a graveyard somehow, play it again, and you're just building this massive board and scrying a ton. So losing access to Imperial Oath does kind of cut that off for me as a potential path. But I do think that on average in the white attrition decks in my cube, this is going to be more useful. So I think it's probably going to come in. But I'm a little bit unsure about the slot overall. But I think there's a reasonable argument. It's worth consideration either way. And if you're not running either one, I would definitely recommend considering running one or the other, because I do think that it's the kind of top end that white attrition decks can actually make use of pretty well.
Final note is this is the type of card that makes cards Stern Scolding like just not okay in an environment like ours. We cut Stern Scolding for a lot of reasons, but when it nabs a 6-drop on the stack, it's kind of like, ooh, all right, game over. Yeah, that'll be interesting to see how this one actually plays out in comparison to the spell-based form. Not that they're exactly the same, but they are clearly like comparable to one another, which does lead us into our final white card here, which is a Jumpstart card, one of the legendaries from Jumpstart, which means anime art, Teld's favorite. Erdnan Dramoka Warrior is 1 and a white for a 1/1 uncommon legendary human warrior. When it enters, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Could target itself, it could target something else. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature with a +1/+1 counter on it gains first strike until end of turn. If that creature has 2 or more +1 counters on it, it gains double strike until end of turn instead, which obviously you can put the counter on itself, and this is essentially a 2-mana 2/2 first striker on combat. Notably, it says whenever you attack, which they've been doing a lot more recently, so this can put a counter somewhere else and enable a first strike attack the turn it comes down. And then obviously if you have like additional +1/+1 counter synergies or just like incidental +1/+1 counters, you might just end up with accidental first strikers and double strikers because of this card. So kind of cool little package there. I see you've got a little paragraph of text here about Erdnan. Daneelius, so I'll let you speak to it more because I didn't have this pegged as anything particularly special for our cube.
Yeah, so one of the reasons I threw this on there is I've just seen definitely a lot of folks excited for this card. it's the kind of card that I tend to not love because it feels pretty narrow to me. Like you're obviously going to want this in your white-green counters deck, but where else are you going to really want it? So I was thinking about it. It's incredibly powerful in the white-green counters decks. I think it's a lot more powerful than I was giving it credit for. If you think about what tend to be the theme or the payoff cards for a counters deck, it tends to be stuff like Conclave Mentor or Botanical Brawler, things that are adding counters on top of what's already being done. And so if you think about it that way, and you imagine Erdnan coming down and immediately putting 2 counters down because you already have one of those effects in play, now it's kind of giving haste and double strike immediately. It's giving double strike on haste plus these counters to a creature, and that's like a pretty serious upside. To me, the question is more like, where are you playing this outside of white-green counters? Can you get enough counters cards in your white-red deck, for instance? Because again, if you're getting double strike on haste to a creature when this comes into play, that's very strong. So I immediately went to my cube and I was just looking for where do I have access to +1/+1 counters already that's not in white-green, and there's a fair amount that things like armies, for instance, incubate tokens, things that kind of just already have counters associated with them. So I think this is worth consideration. The big question is just like, okay, how many cards do you need alongside of this in your white-green +1/+1 counters deck to make this justify its slot? I think that number is at least like 3, and you want at least 3 other cards that give counters, but preferably more like 5 to 8. And you might not have the environment where that's really doable. But if you can have this be that kind of haste double strike enabler, that's incredibly strong for a 2-mana card that leaves behind this 1/1 body on its own, and in some cases it can just stack counters on itself. So I think I'm way more intrigued than I was when I first saw it, thinking about that kind of haste double strike interaction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this card seems okay. I'm not really interested in it, but I will say they'll work super well with the Glyph Elemental Rosy Cotton type space where you get a bunch of +1 counters. Works really well with a card that's I'm sorry if you mentioned this and I just missed it, but Norn's Inquisitor, because it makes a incubate token with multiple 1/1 counters. Those sort of things play really well with this sort of card. I do think you kind of have to be not necessarily a +1/+1 counter deck, but if you're going to put this in your deck, you do need to be kind of deep on those self-enabling double strike things, I think, though.
Yeah, that's where I would look is what incidental ways do I have to get +1/+1 counters rather than we don't have a +1/+1 counter deck anymore. I don't even think this card obviously it would play into a green-white +1/+1 counter deck if somebody had a cube where that was a really pushed theme, but this card doesn't do anything that deck doesn't already do. Maybe it pushes damage a little bit harder, but it doesn't help solve the glass cannon nature of that deck, which I think is already pretty strong in terms of pushing an early win with things like Conclave Mentor and stuff like that. So this maybe ups the turn count by 1 by just giving something double strike and distributing a counter itself. But if you have enough ways to just get +1/+1 counters, I like the shouts of Amass and Incubate, because that's exactly the type of place I'd be looking to see if there's random +1/+1 counter stuff to make this work. And if you have enough of that going on, I could see there being a world where this is just a nice aggressive card. I can't say I'm super excited about it either. I know Teld's really into the anime art, but totally. I think I'm gonna have to talk him off that ledge. Where are you at on the anime art for these legends, Daneelius? Do you is that something you enjoy?
I love anything that they want to do in terms of weird, crazy, distinctive art. I'm very behind. I definitely like the anime stuff. I just want, I have friends who play other games that get access to more of this cool art more often, and our art just seems so bland at times in comparison. But can I sell you on the following curve? Turn 1 Heartfire Hero, turn 2
Okay, well, hold on a minute.
Sold. All right, yeah, now you're cooking.
You might be onto something. Yeah, okay, well, he clearly knows all he has to do is mention Heartfire Hero to pull out our heartstrings. Yeah, there's some cool stuff going on with this card, especially for a random uncommon legend from the Jumpstart. Those are kind of more designed with Commander in mind, so being able to talk about a couple of them here, which we're going to mention quite a few of them actually. They're pretty cool at the uncommon level. That's it for new white cards. No new white spells to talk about, but we've got a couple reprints that'll come up towards the end, pushing us into blue with a card that I don't know if I'm excited about this, but I kind of like the design at the very least. First blue card is Phantasmal Shieldback. It's a single blue mana for a 1/3 uncommon turtle illusion. It has the illusion text, the old illusion text. Whenever it becomes the target of a spell or ability, you sacrifice it. But when it dies, you draw a card. I was just immediately intrigued by this card because it's kind of similar to Hard Evidence. Like, it's not doing the same exact thing as Hard Evidence. That one just blocks forever. But like, as far as like a 1-mana card that will eventually, you know, draw you a card while blocking, it kind of has that same play pattern. The illusion text, like it matters, but it doesn't on a 1-drop, right? Like, if your opponent wants to blow their removal spell, like, maybe they get to upgrade a shock to kill this or something like that. Maybe they get to blow like a pump spell to kill this, or maybe they have like the worst case scenario is they have something like an on-crop crasher that gets to just kind of target it for free and kill it, but you get your card back and you only invested 1 white mana or 1 blue mana into it. So like, if this is blocking early on and your opponent ever has to use a card to get it out of the way, I think you're fairly happy with it. I don't really know that there's like a deck that's like, oh, I really need Phantasmal Shield back. Whereas, you know, like Hard Evidence is at least a spell that goes to the graveyard for your like Tolarian Terrors and stuff like that. So I think I more like the design of the card and think it's really neat than like, oh, you have to play this card. But I am curious what you guys think.
Yeah, I think this is such a low opportunity cost, and the fact that the thing that sells me on this, they could have made this at 03, and we would probably still be talking about it for being neat, but it would be a more creature-based direct comparison to Hard Evidence, where it's like, okay, you don't get a spell, but you don't have to spend 2 mana, you don't get 2 game objects, whatever. But like, the 1 power is actually relevant in this environment. Like, we have a lot of tokens in our cubes, and being able to block a 1/1 means that this card actually is going to gain you some amount of life. And you're just never, in our environment, you're basically never going to get blown out on this, right? There's almost no ways. There's not like a rest in peace in our environment. Like, I guess there's Kamano if you block and they kill it with specifically the damage, right? But I mean, that's the only thing I can think of.
Yeah, it dodges like Incendiary Flow, right? Because it would sack in response before being exiled. So there's stuff like that too.
And so you're basically always getting your card, and then it kind of. This almost looks like a good reanimation target to me. I know this is silly, but like, we were talking about the white creature that brings back like a creature or a thing with mana value 2 or less, and like, is this the best thing you'd be bringing back? Absolutely not. But it is a card for that. It's a target for Vesper Lark that like always puts you up a card, which is, it's neat if nothing else.
Yeah, I think that the illusion text on this is actually kind of a red herring, because I think that if your opponent spends any amount of mana or time targeting this thing, then it did its job and you're ahead. I think the only real relevance for that line is that you can't really use this in your own aggressive decks, because you can't put counters on this, you can't put equipments on this. But honestly, that's fine, because blue desperately, for the decks that are trying to be, you know, base blue attrition decks that need to get to the late game, this is exactly the kind of card that those decks need, whether it's blue-green or I think blue-black is a place I'm really excited for this, because of, you think about this with Messenger, the card from, the Eldrazi Messenger card that sticks out. Eldrazi Spawn, as you draw extra cards, like blue-black decks with these 2 blue cards, cheap blue cards, in my mind, that's just a match made in heaven. So I think this card's really strong, and I do think that some percentage of the time people are going to fire off their interaction, whatever it is, to kill this, and that's going to be really good for you. So yeah, I think this card is really good. The big downside of it is it's just kind of narrow, because I don't really want to play this ever in a tempo deck, but who cares? Like, blue really needs cards like this in my mind to give it defensive speed when it's trying to get to the late game.
Yeah. There's one other interaction I wanted to shout out, and I don't know if you'll ever play these 2 cards together, but if you play, we currently run Metamorphic Blast from OTJ, which has the option of turning a creature into an 0/1 as one of its modes. And if you block and then you cast Metamorphic Blast, you know, you draw your 2 cards, make your opponent's creature an 0/1. They now have to use a removal spell on this if they're in that interaction. It's kind of a narrow interaction, because you're probably not putting these cards in the same deck, but it did stick out to me as something I'm going to try to do.
Well, you guys are missing the biggest synergy of all, High Alert. This is how we get High Alert in the Peasant cubes. We're going Toughness Matters, 1 mana 3/3s. If you target it, I cantrip.
Oh yeah.
High Alert's also good with Hard Evidence. Yeah, we've got the whole package. Yeah, this is a really cool card. I'm intrigued by the design. It's going to be a matter of like, do I really want to cut a card? Because it is not hard evidence that would be cut for this. It would be something else. So we'll chat about that one off air though, which moves us into another kind of like this one's just a slam dunk. This is like what I would label as a forever card in terms of like playability, but Mischievous Mystic. We talked about this in the mainline cube. It's 1 in a blue for a 2/1 uncommon human wizard with flying, and when you draw your second card each turn, make a 1/1 flying fairy creature token. Simple card, comparable to Emrakul's Messenger, which we got from Modern Horizons 3, which was the 2 mana 2/1 flyer that made Eldrazi spawn when you draw your second card each turn. But this one makes 1/1 flyers, which for the most part is just better than making 0/1s that can sack for mana. Sometimes the ramp creatures are actually a little bit better, but most of the time you'd rather have the 1/1 flyers. And I think we were chatting before we really kicked up the recording here that like the presence of these two cards side by side is almost to the point where we're opening up like new archetype territory for blue, right? Blue kind of go wide, draw 2 style decks that are pumping out tokens. This is a cool card to see, especially coming off the back of Emrakul's Messenger just playing out, better than we had anticipated.
Yeah, the Foundation's Power Creeps and MH3 banger was not on my bingo card for this set. This card's great, right? Like, this card's just fantastic. You play this, I mean, you probably don't want to play this on turn 2, but you can. And if you do play it on turn 3, you follow it up with your Opt or your Consider or whatever, you immediately get a 1/1, and then your opponent has to deal with it. This card seems fantastic. Like, one of the better cards in the set.
Yeah, so I've got a couple things to say about this card. I think the most important card maybe of the set, next to Sunblessed Healer. A couple interesting things about it. Number one, blue has gotten for me 7 different 2 mana creatures that have come into my cube, including this one now, over the last like 6 months, 7 months, something like that. And that has completely changed the complexion of blue. Previously, blue for me was not really a color you'd ever want to kind of have as your base color in my cube. It was a solid support color, but the cheap creatures just weren't good enough to have blue be your base. And that's totally changed now in my mind. The second thing is that now that you have this alongside Emrakul's Messenger as these 2 different draw 2 payoffs, both of those cards make 2 other recent additions in Shoreline Looter and Canyon Crab. Not everybody's playing Canyon Crab, but again, it's a card I recommend. Really good defensive speed for blue. But both of those are 2 mana plays that let you draw extra cards every turn and trigger these effects. So again, you're now getting like blue at cheap mana values doing its own thing and doing it in a pretty synergistic way that is really exciting. The last thing I would say is I have in my blue-black section now is kind of the main place where theoretically I was trying to exploit the draw 2 synergies. I did include Sneaky Snacker. I have Mindless Conscription. I've got Evangel of Synthesis, I think is what it's called. And I really wanted to find some other place to push these draw 2 synergies. And I was looking at white-blue because Prince Imrahil was a uncommon gold white-blue 2-drop from Lord of the Rings. And it just says whenever you draw your second spell, or whenever you draw your second card, make a 1/1, but it doesn't have flying. And now that this exists, I feel like it's kind of hard to include Prince Imrahil because it just seems like a worse version. I will say that 2/1 bodies for us for 2, we have noted are very, very fragile. I have a lot of ways of dealing 1 damage in my cube, and that makes this a little bit... I think that there is a power spike on this. The fact that like somebody could just immediately kill this for value when it gets played. It does make me think that you will often want to hold this for a little bit, but yeah, obviously this is a fantastic card, and I think it really does start to kind of reshape, along with some of these other 2-drops you've had in the last few months, reshape what blue is doing altogether.
Yeah, you were also mentioning looking for cards that play well with Wrath, the DMU Wrath that wants you to tap creatures, and this is churning out creatures that, as you draw cards with Wrath, this churns out more creatures. So, yeah, I think that's a sick little synergy there. I don't know if there's a deck there, but that feels like the kind of basis for some sort of shell you could potentially be running.
This feels like a Clarion Spirit with flying, which would be a hell of a card if they just slapped flying on Clarion Spirit too.
Yeah, I think it's probably it might be easier in some cases.
It's easier to trigger,
yeah,
but yeah. Drawing a second card each turn is easier than casting 2 spells.
Yeah, why not both?
Yeah. Man, I didn't realize that was on my wish list until just now. But can I get Clarion Spirit with flying? I would like die for that. Yeah, very cool card. Like easy peasant like auto include, and I imagine like everybody's peasant environments. We got another jumpstart card here. This is a Sinet Jelly Drover, which is 3 and a blue for a 2/2 uncommon legendary human wizard. When Sinet Jelly Drover enters or dies, create a 1/1 blue jellyfish creature token with flying, and creatures you control with flying get +1/+1. It's a 2/2. I'm not sure if I mentioned that or not. So 4 mana 2/2 that makes a 1/1 flyer when it enters or dies, but also pumps flyers while it's on the battlefield. So functionally, 4 mana for a 2/2 on the ground and a 2/2 in the air, right? When it just enters, also pumps your other flyers, like the non-jellyfish flyers you already control get pumped, and then on its way out, like your jellyfish will shrink, but you get another 1/1. Daneelius, you called this before the episode, you called this the new Whirler Rogue. Do you think that's like accurate, or you think that's just like a contextual way to like talk about the 3 bodies in one here?
I prefer Whirler Rogue to this, but I think that this is close enough, and in some contexts will be significantly better, which is very interesting. I mean, this with Battle Screech, for instance, in a white-blue deck, you just play this and win the game.
I just shuddered.
Yeah, Rogue had access to. So, I think this card is very strong. And to me, the bigger question is, like, do you run this alongside Whirler Rogue if you have access to both? I know some cube creators have banned Whirler Rogue from their environments. I can't remember if you guys have or not, but
no, we love.
I think
we banned Battle Screech, however, because that card was ridiculous.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, but yeah, I think this card is fantastic.
I agree. I actually had missed that this gets you get another dude on the way out. Like, I thought this card was bad, and then after you pointed that out, I was like, oh, this is just Peasant Sanguine Evangelist. This card's great.
I missed it as well.
I also need to mention that I cannot wait until we get a SpongeBob SquarePants Universe Beyond, and we get a reprint of this, but it's SpongeBob chasing jellies. That's going to be that's on my Universe Beyond absurdity bingo card.
SpongeBob Jelly Drover, yeah. How much stock do you put in the fact that this pumps your other fly? I guess you mentioned Battle Screech already, so like if you get any sort of extra value off of flyers that aren't just coming from this card, it's like kind of amazing. Mischievous Mystic into like make a fairy on turn 3 into this on turn 4, like you're just adding so much extra power to the board.
I was gonna say it'd be really cool if we just talked about a card that synergized with this card and made a bunch of dudes for it.
I think there's a chance this ends up being almost more of a blue-white-gold card just because of how strong that line of text is, but I don't think that's really a bad thing anyways, just because this is just a good enough card in any context that if it ends up pushing you to go into blue-white, that's fine. It's just a really, really strong card. Again, I think that there's even a chance that this ends up feeling a little bit oppressive at times, just because like an Anthem that comes with 3 bodies is, it's powerful, very powerful.
Yeah, I guess it's worth noting, too, that some Peasant cubes, like, actually have just blue-white flyers as like a theme, like an actual push theme. We used to do that way back in the day when we first put together our Peasant cube, and like what I always hated about that deck was how linear it was, and like how like everything that says flying on it goes in the deck, and like your draft just kind of drafts itself, and you would play stupid things like Favorable Winds, which goes in exactly one deck, is a decent payoff in that deck but doesn't have any flexibility. And this is like a card that obviously supports blue-white flyers, but takes up a monocolored slot and can go in like a number of other decks as well. So if you are doing just straight up blue-white flyers, kind of similar to doing like green-white +1/+1 counters, like a very linear deck, this is a nice little flex slot that supports that deck, but also has like utility in non-blue-white decks. So kind of cool there as well.
One last little thing is this card's a little bit fragile, so be careful. I don't know how often this will come up, but there could be situations where you either take some blocks or take some attacks and you get creatures damaged, and then your opponent kills this, and because they no longer have the +1 toughness, they die as a state-based action. So just be a little careful with that, but as a reward, it does probably spot you a 1/1 on the way out anyways, so maybe it's not even the end of the world there.
Yeah, you always got to watch for Anthems dying mid-combat. That can definitely change things, or post-combat as well. I'm really excited about the next card. I got the impression that maybe other people were a little bit more tepid on it, but Fey Bloom Trick is 2 and a blue for an instant at uncommon. Create 2 1/1 blue fairy creature tokens with flying. When you do, tap target creature an opponent controls. I think this is like just a rock solid 3-drop with the caveat that like you probably want to be an attacking blue deck to maximize it. Though even in a controlling deck, I think this is quite good. It just keeps your opponent's biggest attacker off your back, adds to the board puts multiple bodies on board for what that's worth. If you have the flying synergies, like this is obviously really good with Sonette Jelly Drover. The way I read this is kind of like the Frostlings type card. I guess the closest example we have now is the Drown Pit. What was that card called? The Drowner. Flood Pit's Drowner. Yeah, that's another similar card. But like, if you need this to be, this can actually just block 3 creatures for a turn by tapping 1 down and then blocking 2 other creatures as well. So I think there's a lot of like little edges on this card, while also just kind of being like a flash Windrake that like stops your opponent's biggest attacker for a turn as well. And of course, if you are attacking, which is where this is ideal, like being able to just get a blocker out of the way while adding to the board, or, you know, turning a race in your favor by preventing you from being attacked by something big while adding 2 bodies to the board. I think there's a lot of little edges on this card, and I'm actually kind of excited for it.
Yeah, this card seems pretty good. I think this seems like a really good Izzet card. I mean, we talked about attacking decks, and Izzet is the blue attacking deck in our cube. As a general rule. So, I mean, I think this card's really good there. I could see this being good in control as a way of trying to start turning the corner, right? You tap down your opponent's best card, you put a clock into play, and now you start leveraging your removal spells, but you're also chipping away at your opponent's life total, or it gives you a couple of little blockers to play with. This feels more like a pretty narrow role player when I think about it at first, but I could see other edges coming up in this that makes it just a nice flexible card. You know, I'm sure there's a number of synergies. We were just talking about the blue go wide kind of increasing value of that. This is good if in the theoretical like blue-black aristocrats deck that probably doesn't exist but kind of could because it makes multiple bodies. So yeah, really interesting version of this effect, just kind of taking a couple of different effects that I think have been a little underpowered in the past and kind of making them into a card that I think seems in my mind it kind of gets there in terms of like I'm at least interested in trying this.
Yeah, I think what I wrote is kind of how I'm feeling, which is that I like that it's an instant and I like that it's a spell, because what I'm trying to do with my blue section is have blue really be the place where instants and spells are pushed the most. The problem I have with it still is that it has the similar problem that most blue creatures have, which is that it's small. You know, ultimately 3 mana for 2/2 of stats it's these days that's just really bad. So I do think it's going to end up being more of a role player as opposed to a card that you just are excited to take early in a pack and put it into any deck. And I was really struggling when I was looking for cards to take out of my cube to include this, like what that would actually look like. So I think in theory it definitely makes a lot of sense. I'm not really sure if it's going to end up making my cube, but you know, if you're somebody who really likes Midnight Haunting, then obviously you're going to like this card. I'm a little bit squeamish on small amounts of power and toughness on blue cards, just because I've been burned by those now over and over again. And now we have access to stuff like Mystic, which is the complete opposite, where you're just able to actually produce a lot of power and toughness. Those are the kinds of cards I think blue really needs, and I just don't know that it needs a card like this, but I definitely can see some roles for it.
Sure. I will piggyback off of something you just said about like there being kind of like a proliferation of 1 toughness creatures and ways to punish them, and like the kind of quote unquote hidden mode here is like the Resolute Reinforcements, Raise the Alarms, right, where you just put 2 1/1s on board at instant speed and block 2 1 toughness creatures, which comes up like a decent amount when you're pushing like for these efficient cards, because you end up with a bunch of 1 toughness creatures. So there's even the edge there where you're not even caring about tapping a creature down. You're just kind of like trading this for a 2/2, or you know, trading this for a couple 1/1s. It is a little awkward that like if you're using this, like if your opponent has a 2/2 and you're trying to use it as like a combat trick to kill the 2/2, and you run it out to tap down a different creature, your opponent now sees that you have these 1/1s and like won't attack into them. If you need the value off of like tapping in a creature, otherwise you would just wait until after attackers. But yeah, I think there's enough here. I am actually legitimately excited about this card. So we'll see if it ends up being like kind of lackluster or not. But I think this is a neat little take on, first off, the flash Windrakes that we've been getting, because Windrake has been quite bad for quite some time, but also like the Frostling style cards, which they've been pushing a little bit as well. I think Flood Pit's Drowner was like the new evolution of Frostling. So final blue card is just a quick one to hit on here. This is Refute, 1 blue for an instant counter target spell, draw a card, discard a card. Teld said he didn't really have much of an opinion about this one. I'm not sure I do either, especially having played it last night. It's kind of cool that like it does the draw a card thing, like it loots for your Mischievous guy, but that only matters if you do it on your own turn, because like looting on your opponent's turn when you're paying 3 mana for a counter spell isn't likely to get you that second draw trigger unless you also have like an opt to follow up with. The question I posed was like, where does this stack up against other cancel variants? And as soon as you mentioned Saruman's Trickery, which is the cancel that makes a 1/1 token, I was kind of like, yeah, like I can't really see playing Refute over playing Saruman's Trickery, and we just don't want that many cancels to start with. So I like the upside of like looting on a counter spell. Maybe if this was like 2 blue, I would be a little bit more excited, but it is 1 blue, so it's just cancel variant, kind of like a more in line with like Dissolve or a Sinister Sabotage and things like that, rather than Saruman's Trickery. So good mention. I don't know if you guys have anything to add to it, but I do think I'm like lower on this now than when it was first previewed.
Yeah, Twist Reality has taught me that I really like when my counterspell can make me a 2/2 in a pinch.
Yeah, we don't even play that one in our cube.
The only thing I really like about Refute is that the full art version that they made, it looks really good in foil. And so I have bought it, but I don't think it's going to make it.
It has a Sphinx on it, right? I was looking at that last night because I had one. I was like, oh, that's a Sphinx. Because it looks like, at a glance, it just looks like something like breathing frost breath or something. But when you look at it closer, it's like, oh, that's a Sphinx. Like, it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? You get to appreciate foils, don't you? Because you play in paper. We don't really get to appreciate those on Arena very much.
Fully foiled out, and I try to bling it out as hard as I can, which is getting harder and harder. They just made a $300 Llanowar Elves, so I don't think I'll be including that one.
You have alternatives for that one, though.
Yeah, just a few.
Yeah, the best we get is like the storybook treatment on Eldraine cards and stuff like that.
That Japanese version is $300.
The special foil version,
the like fracture
rare.
foil or whatever.
Jesus. Yeah, it's like $300.
Okay.
Now we're going to go to black and talk about Chris's favorite card ever printed.
Yeah, Teld, you haven't done much reading. Why don't you go ahead and go through the first couple black cards here, especially since like we've already talked about this first one. We kind of gave it to Chris on this one for the mainline review, but
yeah. So this is a Vampire Gourmand. It's a 1 and a black for a 2/2. And when it attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, draw a card, and this creature can't be blocked. I just don't see the hype on this. I mean, I think it's passable, but I just don't like when I'm forced to sacrifice board presence if I don't want my card to be a bearer. Like, it just doesn't. It doesn't guarantee you draw a card unless you've got to have already drawn like your enabler with it. I'm just not into this. I think it's probably fine in Rectos, but I'm just not going to argue for a slot in this. If you've got something that you really want to swap to try this out, I just whatever. This card's boring to me.
I like it a lot more here than I like it for the mainline cube, because a 2/2 for 2 is not so embarrassing. If it's not doing the thing, it'll often trade for something still. That said, like, if you're not doing the thing, it is just a 2-mana 2/2. If you're not in a position to attack, or you don't have your like payoffs or even enablers on board, it doesn't do very much. I do think it would be a strong card in like a already strong Aristocrats deck, whether that's Rakdos or Orzhov or something like that. But if you already have that deck and it's like it came together, like you probably just have other things that are doing something similar. Granted, if this like kind of gets going, you know, you're sacking like expendable fodder every turn, you're drawing extra cards, you're getting in for unblockable damage, it is probably good. But for every time it's doing that, how often is it sitting back as a 2-mana 2/2 that's not able to attack and is offering no utility at all? That's the question. And probably often enough that like you would rather just have a Vermin Gorger or a Lampad of Death's Vigil or something like that. Even if you're not drawing cards off those, you have a little bit more control over when you're sacrificing things for the stuff that cares about that. That's my big thing, is like I want control over when my sacrifice outlets work. I don't necessarily want to be tied to any particular phase or anything like that. And this is clearly tied to like your own combat step during your own turn, which is very, very narrow.
Yeah, if I wanted to give this card like a little bit of credit, you could, because we do run a couple of steal effects in Peasant, this is a 0-mana way to sacrifice a stolen creature, but it also loses one of the upsides those cards have of getting to push a ton of damage, because you have to sacrifice it at the beginning of your declare attacks. Mm-hmm. And so you don't get to punch your opponent in the face with it first.
True. Though draw a card is usually a bigger upside than like the 1 life gain or whatever, you know, life drain you're getting off of.
Sure.
Whatever.
I think when you're playing the steal effects, though, I do think that the damage that the creature you steal deals is quite frequently more important than any sort of card advantage. Because very frequently, I mean, it just opens up such a big attack, and you attack with the creature. It's oftentimes just lethal. Which I guess, like, if it's just lethal, you just don't sacrifice the creature, right? You just kill it.
Sure. And I mean, those decks will have other sack outlets as well. I'm reading Daneelius' comment on this card. It sounds like you're not a huge fan of it as well. How much like sacrifice energy is there going on in the 540 cube?
A fair amount. To me, so there are two thoughts on this. One is that I do think that this is going to end up playing pretty well in Foundations Limited because there is a common steal effect, and I do think you guys have already talked about this. I think that's the primary place that I want this, because while I definitely agree that you're losing something by having to sack the creature pre-combat, the fact that this then gains unblockable kind of does help make up for that a little bit in terms of, kind of repaying you on the lost damage. And just free sack outlets are really what you desperately need alongside steal effects. So I think in limited, I think it's going to play pretty well, and that's going to have people thinking that it's better than it is. Ultimately, I think a card has never needed the enters or attacks text more than this one, just because when you're on the draw, this is just going to do nothing. It's not going to do anything at all, and I think that's really unacceptable. So, there will be situations where this feels awesome, and I think that'll make people think that it's better than it is. I think it's not very close for me.
Okay, can I interest you in Mischievous Mystic plus Vampire Gourmand?
You can, yeah.
And it just constantly replaces that 1/1.
Yeah, we're just doing peasant budget Yawgmoth.
Right.
It is funny to me still that this card looks just like Yawgmoth. Like, it looks like the same exact character to me.
I just really hate having abilities attached to attack triggers, and the fact that in addition to this being attached to attack trigger, it also requires you to lose board presence. So it's like those two things combined, they're kind of at odds with each other. So it requires a very specific situation for it to be good. And in that situation, it's just a 2/2, and it dies to anything. So, and without having a relevant end of the battlefield. So I think it's too weak for me.
That's fair. I think I agree. This card will play out quite well in the retail limited format. We have reassembling skeleton there as well, so that's kind of like a wombo combo for a retail limited environment. Quick redundant card, wanted to mention Vengeful Blood Witch here as well. Mentioned it in the mainline cube. This is 1 in a black for a 1/1 uncommon vampire warlock, and whenever it or another creature you control dies, target opponent loses a life and you gain a life. So it's nothing exciting there. If you're playing Zulport Cutthroat and you just want 50 of these in your cube, you have another one to play with.
If you're playing in 1v1, this is just strictly better, right? Because it gets a trigger on the way out and it also commits a crime.
I would not use the terminology strictly better, because committing a crime does not make a card strictly better or worse. But
it is strictly better though, because it has whenever this creature dies, right? Zulport doesn't. It's whenever.
No, Zulport triggers on itself.
Does it trigger on itself? I thought it only triggered on other things. Okay, my bad.
No, Zulport counts
Zulport
itself.
Triggered on only on other creatures.
Yeah, but I mean that there is a distinction here for multiplayer that Zulport hits all of your this is actually just worse if you don't care about targeting specifically for crimes. I did one thing I wanted to mention here, because it's going to come up with one or two other cards, and I already mentioned the Soul Sisters as well. Is I feel like with this set I'm really solidified in that space where there are so many redundant versions of the same kind of effects at this point, where in our cube in particular it's kind of for the blood artists, we're kind of locked in on the number of blood artists we're playing, and every time we see a new one, it's not a conversation of whether the new one's good or not. It's a comparison between that and the one we already have. We're gonna see this again with the 4-mana Eternal Witness from this set. They're repeating, they're kind of hitting the same marks over and over again on certain type of effects, to the point where we already have good versions of those. How many do you want? And this is a similar one. This one's pretty easy, that this is just worse than a lot of the other blood artists that we have, but I think it'll come up at least one or two other times in this recording. But that said, Vengeful Blood Witch is not an exciting card. It's only for those degenerates out there who are building straight up aristocrats cubes or something like that. Teld, do you want to read the next one? I'm excited about this card, but I don't really know why it needed anime art. Maybe this isn't anime art. I think all of the new to Magic Jumpstart cards were given the anime art treatment. So this is at least an attempt to be anime art, even if it doesn't really come through that way.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Okay, well, we're talking about Wriggling Grub. It's 1 in a black for a 1/1 worm, and when it dies, you make 2 1/1 worm creature tokens. I think this is pretty good. I mean, 3 bodies for 2 mana is quite a good deal. And we have a number of kind of small ball reanimation effects and cheap creature triggers and things like that that pay off with this. We mentioned Vesper Lark earlier, and just another card you can pick up that puts a bunch of crap into play. And so I think this card will probably play out pretty well. I think it just don't look flashy, but I think the fact that you're just spending 2 mana and you're getting a total of 3/3 worth of stats across 3 bodies will end up playing out pretty well.
Am I being irrational for thinking this card is very good? Because I think this card is very good.
I think it's a bit deck contextual. I don't think you just want to put this in any random deck. I think you're going to want to try to take advantage of the fact that it makes so many pieces of cardboard, but that's not very difficult to do, right? They're pretty easy. I mean, just some, like, I think black, white, and black, red strike me as the places you really want to play this. But I suppose if you're in black, green, you could just run this as a way to gain, if you read this as just like gain 8 life or something,
Yeah, you just don't get 3 creatures out of a 2-drop, like, ever. Maybe, Mog War Marshal is the card that I brought up as a comparison. Like, when do you ever get 3 bodies from a 2-mana card?
I think it's very interesting. I think like the 2 comparison points that came up to me when I saw this was like Doom Dissenter and Orzhov Enforcer. To me, if Doom Dissenter isn't at least good, which I don't think it is, then I think it's hard for this to be very good, but I do think that this could be good. I think the direct comparison that matters the most is Orzhov Enforcer. Now, obviously, you get more bodies.
Which one's that again? Is that the Afterlife Death Touch guy?
Yep, 1/2 Death Touch for 2 with Afterlife 1.
Okay.
So, I mean, you're getting the key advantage to this card, obviously, is the bodies. And so, yes, like that means that this card, to me, is most useful in a sacrifice deck. And outside of a sacrifice deck, I think I'd rather have Enforcer. But I can understand wanting to play this card. I think that makes it hard for this to be very good. It's more kind of contextually good.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, obviously, like, this isn't a good black aggro card, but I would say, like, the cards you're comparing it to, or the cards you're probably in consideration for cutting to make room for something like this, also aren't good black aggro cards. So, like, I would not call Orzhov Enforcer a good black aggro card. But I don't know that our cube doesn't even really support, like, black aggro intentionally. It's more of like a secondary thing, if anything. But I'm excited about this card. I'm excited for just 3. Like, we do support a lot of, like, creature based graveyard decks plus all in sacrifice decks. And I don't know, 3 I see a 2-drop that makes 3 1/1s, and I'm like, yeah, I'm in.
Yeah, and to your point about this, like the Doom Dissenter conversation, I think it's hard to make that comparison in the sense that this makes 50% more cardboard. Like, it just makes 50% more stuff, which I think can take a card from being, like, not good enough to being very good. I think a 50% increase in output is a pretty notable increase.
Also, this is annoying as shit if your opponent plays a 3/1. Like, if your opponent's aggro and they're, like, on X1s, it's like they're just never beating this card.
Okay,
like,
so let me ask you this. How do you think about, because we think in our cube, one of the better 2-drops for black is Blight Reaper Thallid. And I don't think I would cut Blight Reaper Thallid for this, but I do think they play in kind of a similar space. But Thallid is much more useful in an aggro context or an assertive context than Grub is.
Yeah, we cut that card a ways back, I think.
So remind me, Blight Reaper Thallid is what, a 2-mana 2/2.
2-mana 2/2 for 3 mana. You can 3 mana and 2 life. You flip it into a 3/3 and a 1/1 that also dies into a 1/1.
Okay, yeah. I always thought that card was decent. I think we just cut it to kind of swap spots around for something. I mean, obviously, if you're trying to do, like, the combo sacrifice thing where you're trying to win with, like, weaponize the monsters, Blood Artist type cards, I think you just want the card that gives you all the bodies for the cheapest cost, which is this one. Whereas the Blight Reaper Thallid has more applications in combat, like, it can actually start attacking at some point. So that's an interesting conversation. I think it really comes down to, like, what that slot ends up doing in your cube more often. Like, are your black decks going on the aggressive front, or are they really just, like, sitting back, biding time, and draining your opponents out?
Yeah, I think it's just the difference in mana cost, right? Like, the Blight Reaper Thallid is good, and I like the card, but it is 5 mana to be a real card. Until you pay the extra mana from it in the life, it is just a bear, right? And this always gets its value, right? And I think that's a pretty notable upside to that card in the kind of decks that are going to want to play those cards. I could see the Thallid maybe being better in black-white, since that deck tends to want to be a little more of, like, a mid-range assertive deck. But I think in, like, the context of black-red, I think just getting the most bang for your buck to close the game out with your effects, your makeshift munitions or your Blood Artist type effects, just getting as many dudes into play is probably better. I think it's an interesting comparison, but I do think this card is quite good.
There's a black card I wanted to touch on here. This is one of those, like, I want to talk about it because I think it's a very cool card though I don't actually think it's like super strong. So I'm gonna mention this one because I was intrigued by the design. So this is Ozox the Clattering King, 2 and a black for an uncommon legendary skeleton noble. It's a 3/2, and it can't block, and that's the line of text that kills it, obviously. But it says when Ozox dies, create Jumble Bones, a legendary 2/1 black skeleton creature token that also can't block. And when Jumble Bones dies, or rather when Jumble Bones leaves the battlefield, you return a card named Ozox, the Clattering King, from your graveyard to your hand. So a very cool kind of like endless loop of bodies here. Though obviously like Takken can't block onto both of those makes it like significantly worse than it could have been. Obviously it would have been super annoying, right, if it could block. So I think that's just smart. But I like the idea of like 3-mana creature that dies into a token that dies back into the 3-mana creature and kind of like gives you like this really, really long-term game plan of here's endless bodies. It also works nicely with, the Insidious Roots, Cadaver Lab thing. But those sorts of decks need setup to get to the point where they're doing the thing, and a creature that can't block is not the setup that you want. So this is just a inclusion for the sake of I think this card is really cool and I actually kind of like the art on it, rather than like I'm going to persuade anybody to try to play. Not sure if you guys have any sort of opinion on this one.
I think this is actually just an aggro card. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a good aggro card, but I think if you're going to play it, you just want to be like attacking your opponent and using the fact that this dies into another thing to just let you kind of flunge. I guess you could also use it with Vampire Gourmand, if that's your thing.
There you go. Gourmand's going up in stock.
As an aggro card, how much better is that, or how much would you care about 3-mana 3/2, no ETB, no haste, and it just says unblockable? Like that's a good card, but is it like like to me, I see this more as a combo card almost, because again, the fact that it can't block means it's not really an attrition card in my mind. So I see this as a combo card, and what I think of when I see this is like as soon as we get some kind of a sacrifice outlet that's playable, that creates treasures on sacrifice, something like this gets a lot more interesting to me. Or if you're playing older Peasant environments with like Ashnod's Altar type stuff, this becomes a lot more interesting because it's like a combo card. But in my environment, I think that the can't block is one of the most punishing lines of text I feel like you can put on a creature, especially one that costs more than 2 mana. So I don't think I'm that interested, but I am flagging it for future combo.
Sure, can't block definitely kills the card's playability, but I think it's like, I mean, maybe it begs the question, why make the card at all? But obviously this is a jumpstart card. Like, it's not really meant to be in the limited format or anything like that. But I see some potential here. I do agree, like, it probably needs some more sort of, like, very intentional push before you play it. Because, like, it's not good enough with Insidious Roots type stuff as a creature that can't trade off in combat. Well, on defense. And it's not really that pushed of an aggro card either. Mm-hmm. Though it's, like, kind of fine. But it's cool. I like it. It looks like a Dark Souls boss.
It does. It also needs to be mentioned some percentage of the time you're going to play this, or your opponent's going to Pillar of Flame, and you're just going to feel miserable.
You'll be sad. Yeah. Okay. Another here's another one I want to get your guys' opinions on. I actually played this last night and found it to be not particularly interesting, though I did think there were quite a few 1 toughness creatures floating around the limited format. But Seeker's Folly is 2 and a black for a uncommon sorcery. Choose one. Target opponent discards 2 cards, or create creatures your opponents control get -1/-1 until end of turn. So I usually hate the Mind Rot effects. Like, I've never really seen a Mind Rot that I've considered for a cube environment, but I do think the mini infest mode is a nice thing to tack onto a modal Mind Rot, because Mind Rot is occasionally good. You know, Mind Rot like falls flat sometimes, which is why you don't put it in a cube that often. Is like sometimes it's just a dead card. Sometimes you just can't get away with casting a Mind Rot for 3 mana if things are too aggressive. But I think giving that some modality and letting it be like a mini creature sweeper gives it some play in different matchups, right? Mind Rot's good against control, generally. -1/-1 can be good against aggro, so like this kind of covers different bases. I think -1/-1 is a lot closer to -2/-2 in an environment like ours than it would be in, you know, a lot of different environments, because a lot of things that are pumping out tokens and going wide, and your things like Release the Dogs and Battle Screech usually are just making 1/1s rather than 2/2s. So I think like -1/-1 is actually acceptable as a mini sweeper. I'm not excited about Mind Rot, but like if you're going to give me modality on a card, I think this is fine, and I think it's actually in, you know, the conversation as a card from the set worth considering. What do you guys think? In fact, Daneelius, I know you play a Mind Rot variant, No Way Out, I believe, is the one that makes a Decayed token. I know you've had that in your cube at some point or another. So, like, where are you at on Seeker's Folly?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple points of discussion here. One is just the necessity in your environment of -1/-1 effects. I think it's like crucial that you have some amount of that in your cube, because if you don't, you have to kind of intentionally depower white. I think white is just at this point way too good at flooding the board with tokens and then pretty easily going over the top with any kind of pump effects. It's just a play pattern that's very difficult to stop unless you have some amount of counterplay to that makes them think twice about just jamming every single make 3 bodies card into their deck. So I do think it's really important to have some amount of this effect in your cube. The problem I have with this card specifically, yes, you could compare it with No Way Out. I'll say that No Way Out is one of the weakest cards in my cube, and it's maybe on the way out. But that giving you an actual object alongside the discard 2, that's the only reason why I'm playing it. The fact that you have to choose one or the other. I mean, if this was both modes here, or choose one or both, like, I would be much more interested in this. The biggest problem I have with this card is just comparing it to Nightclubber, and it's just so much worse than Nightclubber in my mind. The only place I would ever really want this over Nightclubber is in specifically like a Grixis Spells kind of a deck. And maybe you need this kind of effect for a Grixis Spells deck in your environment. For me, I'd rather have stuff like Fear Fire Foes or even Hazardous Blast potentially, though that's maybe not the best in a Grixis deck. But the point is, I guess there are some applications I can see for this. They're really niche, and again, just putting it side by side against Nightclubber to me is it's a tough sell.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm not entirely opposed to having 1 or 2 super flexible sideboard cards in a cube, but I kind of agree as far as dealing with the token storm. I did like Nightclubber. It's a card that's been in and out of our cube a couple of times, and I think it's good for dealing with a lot of the flood the board type cards. I don't think that this one's quite pushed enough for me to be interested in it, but I'm not opposed to this 1 or 2 cards like this in the cube conceptually, where their main job is just to be a good sideboard card against a variety of matchups. So I think that's cool, but yeah, I don't think this card quite gets there.
Yeah, the card that came to mind for me for our cube specifically was Golden Demise as like the -2/-2 for 1 black, where again, I think -1/-1 in a cube like ours often does what -2/-2 does when you consider all the hop to its and things like that are just spitting out 1/1s. Obviously, like, there are times you want infest, you want actual -2/-2, but I was like, is the flexibility of, being a Mind Rot when that doesn't matter against control decks and stuff like that, is that enough to like make it a consideration over like a traditional -2/-2 effect? And I'm not sure where I stand on that, but like I said last night, I wasn't super impressed with this card, even in an environment where I pegged there being a bunch of like -1/-1s, because what's your opponent going to run out a bunch of Generous Strays and Pawn Prophets, and like, yeah, you sweep them away, but they're still up on cards in that exchange. Like, unless they're literally an aggro deck, dumping a bunch of X1s on board, like, it's not really that big of a deal to sweep them away. And another card I was not impressed by at all was the Let's Play a Game, from Duskmorn. Like, even with Delirium active, I didn't think that card was that good, and that actually does combine -1/-1 and a Mind Rot and a Lightning Helix to your opponent's face all on one card, and I still didn't think that card was particularly good. So
yeah, I think this one's tough in a comparison with other games.
Yeah. So yeah, we can move on from there, but maybe there's a conversation point about that one when we actually start talking about swaps. Teld, do you want to talk about the new flashback card here?
Yeah, so we have Revenge of the Rats. So Bloomburrow is back, and the rodents are not happy with us. So we have 2 black for a sorcery, and we create a tapped 1/1 black rat creature token for each creature card in your graveyard, and as flashback for 2 black. Oh, that's way cheaper than I thought it was. Okay, yeah, this is cool. So it's Rise of the Varma spider spawning type card, but it's native in black, which I think is pretty good, because a lot of the ways to dump creatures in the graveyard are in black and green. I guess they go hand in hand. A lot of the mass mill cards are in green. But this having flashback, as Daneelius kind of points out, is that you don't have to worry about milling over this in your mill heavy black green deck. You can just put it in your graveyard and then flash it back. I like that this card doesn't put all the creatures in play untapped. Because of the flashback being so easy to get in these mill heavy decks. One of my problem and one of the reasons we ultimately cut spider spawning was a lot of times you would just cast it and put 5 to 7 things into play, and your opponent just no longer had ways to actually kill you. This is kind of more like Rise of the Tides, where you have to have a stable-ish board or be in a spot where your opponent's not just beating down incredibly hard on you. You've got to have a spot to find where you can cast this and get to untap with it, which I think makes a little more interesting gameplay for this sort of card, as opposed to just casting this and it immediately hard stabilizes the game and there's no way to lose.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this card. I have no idea if it's good, to be honest. I think that the tap clause is incredibly punishing, and that being said, the flashback on this makes it so much more interesting than Rise of the Varmints. I tried Rise of the Varmints, and I think it's a cool thing to do like one time, because it ends up being, you have this kind of like Rube Goldberg machine that you have to put together, where you're both milling yourself, putting a lot of creatures in your yard, but you also have ways of returning the rise, because undoubtedly you're playing self-mill effects, and you're just going to mill it, and then oh darn, my deck doesn't really work anymore because the whole reason I drafted this deck is in my graveyard and I can't get it back. So having to like stitch all the pieces together is a fun puzzle like once, and then you try to do it the second time and you fail, and you're like, well, this card doesn't do anything. So the fact that you can cast Revenge from the yard is a massive upgrade in my mind to Revenge that makes this playable at all. And again, yes, the fact that it's in black. Though I will say green and blue in my environment that basically does just as much self-milling as black does. So though obviously black will have, generally speaking, more creatures than blue. So I think this is very interesting. To me, if this can't carry a deck, it's not worth running. And so that's really the question, is like, when you include this, do you feel like this is the most powerful thing in your deck? Do you feel like you actually have real inevitability? If you don't, I don't think it's worth including in the queue. But I'm going to try it. I'm going to see if it can work out. That tap clause is really brutal. The fact that you can't just play this and stabilize stuff.
So I have a thought with this card, and just gonna throw it out there. Is there a world where you draft a red-black deck that is
I was going to ask the same thing. Yeah, I was going to ask the same exact thing. Just like for sheer number of bodies in a sacrifice deck. I don't think it would be like your first choice, but I could see a world where there's a Rakdos deck that just wants this as like hop to it with flashback, like I'm going to make this card is going to be worth 6 bodies over the course of an extended game or something like that. And those 6 bodies are, 6 Blood Artist triggers, or, 6 whatever Village Rites, 6 Gourmand, 6 Vampire Gourmand.
Oh, this is sick. This is sick with Whist Drinker Vampire too.
Oh, it is.
In
yeah.
like black white. Yeah.
Oh, hold on. Arabella, Revenge of the Rats, Mardu. Yeah, I could see a Rakdos. I don't think it would be ideal in Rakdos, but I could see a Rakdos deck play it.
Well, one thing I like about the Rakdos shoutout is Blood Token specifically, because I do think you don't want to really cast this on the front side. You will in the situation where it's game winning for you, but you'd much rather store this away in the graveyard, and then at some point in the future, it's just a way to spend 4 mana and make 8/1/1s or whatever. So having like Voldaren and Epicure, and maybe there's another red card coming that some people are really excited about that makes blood tokens. I could see something like that working. I need to see it. I need to see it happen once, where it's like, all right, I'm doing the thing and I'm making a bunch of tapped creatures. I just need to see.
Yeah, we run this with we run Scrapwork Mutt as well, and I'm trying to think of some other cards that might synergize with this. But that's pretty good with them. It gives you infinite fuel for something like a Begarden Dragonheart. Oh man, Molten Gatekeeper.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about another.
Okay, never mind.
Gatekeeper
my new goal is just to make this card completely broken in red-black. I'm just going to draft nothing but red-black sack, and I'm just going to try to force to make this card good.
It is interesting that this is a black card, because most adjacent effects we've seen are green forward on this sort of thing.
That's a really good point.
Okay, last black card. Pretty simple one. Infestation Sage is a single black mana for a 1/1 elf warlock, and when it dies, you create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token with flying. It's funny they use the exact same art for the Swarm Weaver token for this set, so it just makes a Swarm Weaver token. 1 mana 1/1 that dies into a 1/1 flyer. We've seen this before with Doom Traveler, but this is probably just better in black than it is in white, right? And Doom Traveler is a fine card. It's just not an exciting card.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah, Doom Traveler's been power crept at this point into Indebted Spirit. And I will say that I don't know how much better Indebted Spirit really ends up being than Doom Traveler. I don't think I've ever cast it for its aura side, so It's mostly just an enchantment version of Doom Traveler, which is nice for bargain and some other things. But yeah, I agree with you. This is better as a black card. That being said, I don't know. It's hard for me to get excited for this effect. I don't run currently any of the other effects that 1-mana black creatures that make tokens, though I think you can. Nested Shambler is one that gets brought up a lot as a good version of this.
Link Breaker is another one.
For me, I really like the Fairy Dream Thieves, things that provide just a little bit more value. Shambling Ghast, I think I definitely prefer to this. Just getting access to treasure tokens has more upside, but I think this is totally fine. I think it's runnable. It doesn't excite me, but I think it could.
There's not too much to say. I did want to ask, Teld, do you think this is... do you think the 1/1 fire is better or worse than the mercenary that we're getting off the Link Breaker right now?
Well, the mercenary triggers Heartfire Heroes, so...
Okay. Well, okay. Gotcha. You're absolutely correct. Give this man an award. Well, let's move into red to keep things going, where we actually have, I think, one main set card to talk about, and then just 4 jumpstart legendary creatures. So first red creature, though, is Anep, Vizier of Hazaret, 2 in a red for a 4/2 uncommon legendary Jackal Warrior with Trample, 4/2 Trample for 3. You may exert Anep as it attacks. When you do, exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play those cards. And just as a reminder, exert means it won't untap during the next untap step. So 3 mana 4/2, traditionally bad stat line, I think. Trample does not really change my opinion on that very much. It's fine. Trample on a 4-power creature is going to get some damage in, but it's not going to save it from dying in combat to your opponent's 2/2 or whatever. This is essentially, though, draw 2 cards when you exert it, right? And it's the good kind of impulse draw where you have until the end of your next turn to play those cards, so you likely get your land drop off of it. If you flip a land, you usually get your spell off of it. It's really good, obviously, if you flip a combat trick mid-combat and you still have mana up. I do like Daneelius shouted out Gila Courser here as a comparison point, which is the 3 mana 4/2 saddle creature that impulse draws when it attacks. And I think we're not playing Gila Courser, but I think as a point of comparison, that's a good shout. Where are we at on this? I'm kind of taken back by 3 mana 4/2. I hate that stat line.
Yeah, I've made jokes about how many cards in the set just randomly are 3 and 4 mana cards that die to shock, but that's a legitimate concern. There's a lot of 1 mana interaction. I guess some of it, doesn't work until they're attacking, but this just feels like a hard sells because you have to attack, and if your opponent has a bigger creature, you're almost still priced into attacking with this. To a certain extent, you don't want to just sit with a 4/2 in play and not be attacking with it if you're playing it in your deck. I guess it's kind of cool that you get to play both cards. It's not choose one of them, so it can be a convoluted draw too. But then you have to compare: is this actually better in your deck than Light Up the Stage? Mm-hmm. Those cards are just generally a little more efficient. I think for me, a 4/2 is just a deal breaker. I don't think I'm gonna buy in on this. Although if you ended up making it be good, I could see something like plot Coyote into play a net into impulse draw 2 cards for the next turn being kind of a cool line. But I think you have to go out of your way to make this card actually good. I don't know if you're ever attacking a second time with it.
All right, I'm gonna try to sell you guys on this card. I think this card is very good.
Okay.
And maybe more important than very good. I think it's very interesting. I thought a lot about this since you added it to the document. So one thought is that I do think that the 4/2 stat line would be and is going to be. This isn't obviously in the main set in Foundations, but there is another 3 mana 4/2 that we're talking about later that is in Foundations. I think that stat line is going to be way worse on Arena Ladder, for instance, because the best decks that you're going to be playing against are pretty likely to have Burst Lightning and Strength.
Stab.
What's it called? There's a black 1 mana. Yep, Stab. You're very likely to be playing against those cards against good players on Ladder, and this thing is just going to die. It's going to die all the time, and trading 1 mana for 3 mana is really unacceptable. If you think about Cube, though, it's you're not really facing... yes, it does matter what access your Cube has to 1 mana interactive spells. This is going to be a really good target for a 1 mana interactive spell, and it's going, assuming they have it and they haven't used it yet, this is always going to eat that spell. So that is the downside. We have described the downside. I think every other situation, this card is kind of cracked. And so there are a couple things to note. First of all, I disagree on your comment about Trample. I think Trample is incredibly important on this card because your opponent always has to block this. If they don't have the interactive spell and you attack and exert with this, they're just going to block because they're going to be. Or if you just attack and don't exert, that's another situation where you are basically baiting them into the block because next turn you could exert to draw the 2 cards. So they're going to want to block this all the time, which makes this a very interesting card in like the green-red trick space or the red-white tricks, which that has been an archetype that, especially since Heartfire Hero has come in, it has really, I think, gotten way better in my environment. Tricks is now an archetype I'm really excited to draft at this point. It's a 4-power creature for red-green power matters. Imagine this with a Picnic Ruiner or similar effects. I think that's also pretty relevant. And just disregarding potential synergies, I think the fact that this, again, will often trade with a blocker and draw you 2 cards, if that ever happens, you're so far ahead, and red does not get access to that kind of effect very often. So to me, it's like, and you mentioned Gila Courser at the beginning. I do play Gila Courser. I'm not over the moon about it. I don't think it's amazing. But again, giving red access to a draw effect like that, again, in decks that will often have ways of protecting a creature in combat or tricking over a block, I think there's really something here. And I do think the thing that matters for most cube curators is like, what's the density of 1-mana interaction you have? Because yeah, if people are very often going to have one mana interaction for this, then you probably don't want to play with it. But the fact that it at least has 2 toughness means that it gets through 1/1 blockers, and again, the trample is incredibly relevant there as well. So I really think there's something here. I think you just got to look at your 1-mana interaction suite, and if you have a lot of it, then yeah, you probably don't want to play with this card. If you don't, I really, at very least, I would test this because I think it's going to play really, really well.
You might be right that like three mana 4/2 is not a good stat line, and like trample doesn't change it that much. But like 3 mana 4/2 that draws 2 cards when it dies, even if you're not doing anything tricksy with it, even if you're sending it to its own death, even if it trades down against a 2-drop, like if it's replacing stuff with 2 cards, that might actually just be good enough. Like that's a good point, because my problem with 3 mana 4/2s is that they trade with 2-drops, but if it's replacing stuff with 2 cards, kind of like a super Clockwork Monkey,
Yeah. So I guess if we're like thinking about this, if you play it on turn 3, right? Your opponent, if they don't have a 2-drop, I guess you exert this, you get to draw, and now they have to kill it anyways. You get to draw 2 more cards later, and they just draw 4 cards. So on the play, I could see this being like kind of crazy. I guess there's also the follow-up of if you play like a Glimmerlight, for example, or it attracts a Skitterfang and you give it some sort of evasion or stat buff so that it can attack through. Yeah, maybe I'm undervaluing the fact that this is just draws actually 2 cards. Like I know I mentioned it as like a reason that this card could be good, but like I guess we don't actually see that very often, right? Cards that can legitimately just impulse draw 2. This is almost always impulse draw 1, and they only do it 1 time. Like this card could conceivably draw you 4 cards over the course of a game.
Also, so one of the reasons I really like, I've been playing with Caparocti Sunborn for a little while. It's the 2 white red 4/4. When it attacks, you can tap an artifact and discover. And one of the things I've noticed with that card is it tends to snowball, because oftentimes the card that you hit off the discover is an interactive spell with the card they were hoping to block with. So imagine you attack with Anep, you exert it, and their plan was to block this with the 2/2, and you just
Monstrous
hit a
Rage
removal spell
removal
as one of your 2
spell,
cards,
yeah,
or a Monstrous Rage or anything, and you just get to keep going. It's like, so I do think, I really think there's something here. I agree with you. On the draw, it gets worse, but on the draw, a 4-power blocker becomes a lot more interesting because you can trade this up potentially, or you can make sure that it doesn't die through a trick or whatever else. So it's really the thing that makes this bad in my mind is interaction. And if they don't have that interactive spell, I think it's going to play really well. But yes, when they have the interactive spell, it'll feel terrible. So it is, maybe it's a swinging card in that way, but for a 3 mana card that doesn't have an ETB, I think that this is.
We can bring out the Jank Diver favorite word. We can call it polar. And then that'll just describe it. Yeah, I guess red also like is the color that's most likely to have cheap access to cheap interaction. This could be actually a kind of a sweet Gruul card too, where you've got more pump spells, fight spells, things like that to push it through. But yeah, this is a card that I thought was cool when I first saw it. And I kind of talked myself down on it, but I might be falling into a trap that I accuse people of falling into all the time, which is that just because something dies to Doomblade, you do have to consider the situations where they don't have the Doomblade, right?
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think the selling me on it is working. I did think when you said, like, let me sell you on it, I thought you were just going to say Heartfire Hero again, and I was going to be like, yeah, okay, I'm in. Like, it has no synergy with that card whatsoever, but yeah, I want to like the card too, so...
I will say I also actually like this art. I know we talked about the anime art, but I think this actually looks like actually pretty good. It's just like a stylized art as opposed to looking super anime to me.
Yeah, and I will say 3 mana 4/2 does excel when you're playing the 4-power payoffs like Nessun Hornbeetle, Garruk's Uprise, and stuff like that.
Yeah, I want to jump us way back to earlier in the episode when we were talking about the backup agent card that gives creatures first strike. All right, so we play this, and then on turn 4 we give this first strike and we exert. Let's go.
This plays very, very, very well with Hunter's Talent, but maybe that's not really a fair thing to say about a card because that card is just self-contained nonsense.
I was gonna say that's like big. That's big combos with Luris energy.
All right, another 3-drop jumpstart red creature here. We have General Kriat, the Bolt Bringer. 2 and a red for a 2/2 uncommon legendary goblin soldier. Whenever one or more goblins you control attack, create a 1/1 goblin that's tapped and attacking. Whenever another creature you control enters, General Kriat deals 1 damage to each opponent. So another one of the... This is what I was talking about, where they're just hitting the same notes, because we got Molten Gatekeeper in Modern Horizons 3 as like a body with the impact tremors on it. We got War Leader's Call earlier this year as an anthem with the impact tremors for people who play paper Magic and have access to like Commander product. They got Agate Slinger or whatever it's called from Bloomburrow, which is a offspring creature that has impact tremors attached to it. Like they're throwing this text around left and right. As it stands, 3 mana 2/2 with the impact tremors ability that also has the ability to create its own tokens. God forbid you're playing like other goblin synergies, or you have like Battle Cry Goblin into General Kriat. That's just very, very powerful as well. But ignoring kind of like goblin synergy, 3 mana 2/2 that makes a 1/1 when it attacks. That's also attacking. That also pings your opponent when creatures come in. I think there's a nice package there. I will ask the question. Molten Gatekeeper has been, I think, a really good card. It just plays into like this proliferation of like things that dump extra tokens and bodies on board. How much of Gatekeeper's power is tied to it being a 2/3, and how much of its power is tied to the fact that it has Unearth compared to General Kriat here?
Yeah, I think unlike the other card that's really similar to an MH3 card, when we looked at the Mischievous Stricture, I don't think this card is as good as Molten Gatekeeper. The 3rd point of toughness, putting it out of shock range, is not something that comes up all the time, but it's kind of relevant. It's something that, like, if you don't have other goblins, then you have to attack with this, which means you're almost always suiciding it to do so. So, like, the Gatekeeper obviously doesn't even have that option, but the Unearth is quite powerful, especially when I'm trying to put together my Revenge of the Rats Molten Gatekeeper Aristocrats combo deck. I'm going to need that to be able to cast it out of my graveyard to set up the combo, which this doesn't do. Yeah, I think this card's fine. Like, I was a little higher on it at first when I was like, oh yeah, I'm sure we have a bunch of goblins, but like, we really don't have that many goblins. Yeah, I think you need to have these goblin synergies to really want to use this, or you've got to have some way to consistently pump this. So if you do maybe a red-white equipment deck, maybe you'd be interested in this, but there's probably better payoffs even there. Yeah, 2/2 for 3 mana, I'm not super into. Like, the other card that we talked about, Inept, I think the upside, the self-contained upside, was high enough that I kind of got talked on it, and the fact that it could block reasonably well was a selling point. This doesn't attack nor block particularly well, and even though it makes a goblin, if a lot of times that goblin, because it's tapped and attacking, that's actually kind of worse than just putting a goblin into play, right? Because now your opponent just blocks with, like, you know, if they have a 1/2 in play, or they have their little 1/3 blue shell creature card that we talked about earlier, the turtle. So yeah, I think this card is probably fine. If you put it in your cube and I saw it in there, like, there's a possibility I would draft it in some decks, but I don't think I want to replace Molten Gatekeeper with this. I think that card has a substantially higher ceiling.
Yeah, I think if this text was when you attack, I'd be interested. The fact that it's when you attack with a goblin means that if I saw this in a pack in cube, I'd be like, oh, there's a goblin theme, because otherwise I just don't think it's worth it. But if you do have a goblin theme, then I think this could get there. But otherwise, not interested.
I could see a world where people are jamming things like this. Molten Gatekeeper, actual impact tremors is on the client as well. It's on Arena. Like, I could see a red deck structured around this sort of effect if you're just like kind of ignoring the goblin part of it. That said, like, this is competing with Molten Gatekeeper for us, which has been just a rock solid card and a personal favorite of mine too, coming out of that set. So
I also have to say this is where there's sort of an art disparity here, and I know you don't make cube decisions necessarily about art, but when you're talking about two cards that are like similar, I think this art is really cringy. And Molten Gatekeepers is like one of the parts of LCI that I really liked, was the sort of automaton secret city, ancient technology under the ground. I thought that was one of my favorite parts of LCI, and the Gatekeeper is evocative of that.
Sure. How to Train Your Dragon is up next. Dragon Trainer is 3 red for a 1/1. Again, ship it. Uncommon Human. It's so weird to just see a creature that's type line human. I don't know if you guys have that same reaction or not, but when it enters the battlefield, create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. So 5 mana 1/1 that makes a 4/4 flyer. Very similar in concept to the Guarded Air, the 6 mana 1/1 in white that makes 2 3/3s, where you're really trying to find a way to exploit a small body to get the extra tokens off of it with like reanimation or whatever, blink effects. But this one being native to red does make it a little bit more skeptical, I think, than the one in white, because there's just less... There's fewer ways to bring it back. Daneelius pointed out here that being double red instead of like 4 red makes it less splashable in decks that could try to do something cool with it. It misses out on a lot of, small ball reanimation because of its mana value. Sure, you can use like a Zombify to bring this back, but that's really not that different than just paying 5 mana to reanimate a 4/4 flyer with no extra text, which isn't that exciting. So I think there's probably combos with this. The card that comes to mind for me is Blood for Bones, where this leaves behind the 1/1 body that you can sacrifice and then immediately bring back for another 4/4 dragon. But I think unless you're doing something exploitative with this, with the actual 1/1 body, it's like really not that exciting. 4/4 flyer for 5 is not that good. In fact, not very good at all. And a 1/1 body isn't going to do much. So you do have to find something to do with that 1/1 body or some sort of recursion before I'm really excited about this card.
Yeah, there's obviously stuff with like Norin that when we're running it that you can do, and there's some other things. The Blood for Bones is obviously a good shout. One of the lines that stuck out to me was, and this is probably Magic Christmas Land, but like something like turn 2 plot Coyote, turn 3 play Begarden Dragonheart, and then you play the Coyote, give the Dragon haste, and then sack the 1/1.
Misclick the 1/1, give the 1/1 haste. Yeah,
there we go. Yeah, but I think I was really excited about this card when I saw it. But I do think Daneelius' comment about this being red instead of red is notable, because I don't think this is better than AMR or going to be really competing necessarily, because it doesn't have haste, even if the 4/4 flyer is probably better than the ground-based bodies you could produce. So you kind of have to go out of your way to do this, and we don't really have good red decks that are also interested in just grinding resources, or at least not consistently. We saw some decks that do that show up, but they also tend to be super cheap, and I think one of the problems this card has is I really think they could have just... Would this card have been broken if it was 4 mana? And it was red 3? Would that be broken in Modern Magic?
It'd be a lot stronger. I mean, it would just be a better card.
Sure.
One thing I think is worth noting here is the fact that they made this card and Guarded Air tells me that we might have more synergies coming with this sort of card in the next few sets. So I do think it's worth earmarking. But if for red, I'd be so much more excited to have this, like to splash this in my Soul Herder decks or whatever. But I don't know. I think it's a tough sell. To me, the biggest reason you run this is just that it's a unique effect in red compared to the other things we've been getting with the Razor Tide, whatever it's called, the Airmare thing that we got in Duskmourn, and then also Airmare itself.
Yeah,
I think
as well.
Quake Dust Boar, Charging Monster Soar. I think those cards are basically all better than this, but this is doing something different, and that might be intriguing enough to you to run it. But I think ultimately it is weaker than those cards.
Sure. You know what the upcoming synergies are, right? We're getting Ether Drift, where there's going to be a bunch of vehicles, so we're leaving behind small bodies to crew the vehicles while making big tokens.
Yeah. I guess
we're killing it. Last red card. I'm going to let Daneelius read this one, because this was not one I had pegged. I did misread it though. I did misread it on first read, but why don't we go ahead and take Ivora?
Yeah. Ivora, Insatiable Air. This is also very interesting art, but I like all art. Honestly, there's not much art that I can't get into. But so this is 1 in a red for a 1/1 legendary vampire warrior from Jumpstart. So it has a bunch of words on it, which I tend to like. It's got trample. Whenever it enters and whenever it deals combat damage to a player, create a blood token. And whenever you discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Ivora. So very important that this is not enters and attacks. I do think enters and attacks, and I this is an easy include for most cubes, honestly, but enters and deals combat damage is definitely much different. The easy comparison with this card is obviously Voldaren Epicure, which is 1 mana for a 1/1 that makes a blood token. This is 2 mana for a 1/1 that makes a blood token. So the question is, how much juice are you getting out of the other two abilities? One is Trample, and then the really important one is whenever you discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Ivora. So, the first thing that I think I mentioned at some point was I almost am more interested in this card in Vintage Cube, where you can pair this with Wheel of Fortune and potentially be attacking on turn 3 with like a 7/7 or whatever. Like that, there's some interesting stuff there. If you don't have access to wheel effects specifically, then I really do think it just matters mostly like how much access you have to discard in your cube, generally speaking, because if you're just using her own blood token to pump the card up, then I don't think that's probably good enough. I am a sucker for 2 objects for 2 mana or 2 objects for 1 mana. I think that I tend to be pretty forgiving and interested in those effects at that rate, generally speaking. But red has a lot of competition right now at the 2 mana slot, so I certainly don't think you need to add this effect. But if you're running Containment Construct because you have enough effects, like for instance, you get this into combat, you play this on 2, you attack on 3, they go block with their 2/2, you go, okay, activate my blood token, it gets a counter, and then cycle my Oliphant, it gets another counter. It's like there's some interesting things there, and then again, you get to make another blood token, and it does start to snowball from there, potentially. So I think it just really depends. If you're running Containment Contract in your cube, I think you probably should be running this as well. If you're not, then you probably shouldn't.
Yeah, I see Psychic Frog. That's what I see when I look at this card.
Absolutely, exact same card.
I think there's definitely a dream here with this card, and I think it's a really cool synergy card that's a little more pushed than we would have seen. I think a couple of years ago, this card would have had like once per turn when you discard a card, you may put a +1 counter. I think the fact that it's really open gives it play in older formats primarily, like you said, because I don't think we're really taking advantage of that. But this strikes me as the kind of card that could have some home in some sort of Grixis shell where you're taking advantage of cards like Shoreline Looter or, all these various looters we've gotten access to over the years to be able to kind of pump this up a little quicker. I think, obviously it's a great Madness enabler. And synergizes in that sort of shell. So I definitely think there's something here. I don't think it's necessarily for our cube, but it is a cool card to earmark as a card that is going to be good in somebody's cube.
Yeah, it's a synergy card. It's like an all-in synergy card. I mean, good with things like Faithless Luden and that little 2/2 Menace Gremlin from the last set that loots or rummages when creatures come into play. Obviously very good with that one because it just gives you a trigger right away off of this. So yeah, I need to see the synergies before I'm interested. This one doesn't really hold its own, but if you have the kind of like Containment Construct package, there's definitely something to it. Cleon, another jumpstart 3-drop. Cleon Mary Champion is 2 and a red for a 2/2. Is this a Fire Emblem character? 2 and a red for a 2/2 legendary human soldier with double strike and heroic. Whenever you cast a spell that targets Cleon, exile top card of your library. You may play it until the end of your next turn. Daneelius, you're actually the only one who even had a comment on this one here. That I think you pulled this one out. How excited are you for 3 mana 2/2 that can potentially draw some cards? Double strike. 3 mana 2/2 double strike. Sorry, I should probably add that in.
Yeah, so for me, always in a card like this, so it doesn't have an ETB, it's slightly undersized for its mana value. The thing I need to see on a card like that is card draw snowball, basically. And specifically, the snowball is what I'm interested in here. The problem with this card in my mind is I see it as mostly an archetypal card. I really only want to play it in that Tricks archetype I was talking about before. However, in a Tricks archetype, I think it's incredibly strong because, again, the fact that you can go use my growth effect on this to trigger heroic into another growth effect that triggers heroic into another. You can really kind of pop off.
Yeah, it's not once per turn. Yeah, that's a good point.
Or just you just dig deeper for the next one that's going to keep on triggering this. So that to me is actually very exciting. The problem I have is I just don't know that I'm going to run it anywhere else. Like, is this good enough to just run in your red-white deck or your red-blue deck? That's just being a red aggro deck in general. I don't know about that. Really, the main reason why this stuck out to me is just because of how well performing the Heartfire Hero trick decks have been lately. I think this will be very strong in those archetypes, especially again, if you imagine in a red-green deck, you play this on 4 with your Snakeskin Veil up, and this is going to be a really juicy target for the removal, and then you counter the removal spell, draw a card. I really think there's really strong play patterns for this in that trick style deck. I'm concerned that that's basically the only place that I'd want it. So I have a hard time recommending it, but again, I'm always, whenever I see snowball potential, especially around drawing cards, I'm interested.
Yeah, I think one thing this highlights for me is how much of an improvement Valiant was over Heroic. Like, they're not exactly the same, but like being able to trigger Valiant off of like equipping or, targeting with abilities, like even if it's just like a random like haste effect off of a land or something like that, and just make sure you have more ways to trigger Valiant. Nice improvement. Not that I'm saying like Heroic cards are necessarily worse because they're not Valiant cards, but you will get in spots where it's like, man, I could have triggered Heartfire Hero with this thing, but I can't trigger Cleon with this thing. So I like, that's just me giving like a little bit of praise to the Valiant mechanic. I do like the shout that this can chain spells off the top. It's not something I had really considered. Is every spell you hit off the top that can trigger Heroic is another dig towards another card. So that's kind of cool too.
Yeah, I think Valiant is so much better for Cube. I think this card is fine, but I think for the purposes of Cube, if you want these effects, they need to have Valiant because there's so many more effects that target than there are spells that we're going to run that target. Being able to use equipment or like Neighborhood Guardian, Rosy Cotton, all these sort of things to trigger your cards is just a lot easier, and I think it gives a little more flexibility when you're drafting to draft something interesting as opposed to like a prescriptive deck. That being said, this card's fine. I have no problem with it, just not a card I'm interested in.
You probably know what you're doing with this card if you add it to your cube. It's not something you just slot in and be like, oh, I want to see what it does. It's like, no, you're doing something with combat tricks. This plus Monstrous Rage is what? 12 damage?
Or Picnic Ruiner or, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's definitely... But again, it's only there. In that slot, I think it's very interesting, and everywhere else it's kind of like, yeah.
Exactly. This is for your... Whenever you revive the combat cube, Teld, this is one to keep around.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a card that I wanted to mention. Then we're going to get into green, where we're going to talk about 3 green creatures, and then we're going to move into the reprints. This is what I was talking about at the beginning of the episode when I said, like, certain spots in our cube and, Peasant Cube in general have solidified themselves to the point where, like, good cards are competing with good cards now. So the card in question here is Elvish Regrower. 2 green for a 4/3 uncommon elf druid. When this creature enters, return a permanent from your graveyard to your hand, which I don't think any of us can say anything bad about that card. That is just a rock solid 4-drop, 2-for-1 creature with okay stats for what you're, the regrowth ability. I'm willing to give up like a point of toughness to get a permanent back from my graveyard. So my question is not, is this card good enough? I think it'd be a little silly to say that it's not just like a good enough card. It's the competition that it has with all of these different effects. Like it feels like this is one of those like blueprint slots. You know how they have like the blueprint for every limited set where it's like a green grave digger type card, because we got Evolution Witness earlier this year in Modern Horizons 3, and we just got Underneath the Skin, which is also just an excellent card. We already have Timeless Witness, and if you're playing in paper, you have Eternal Witness as well, on top of whatever other regrowth style effects throughout Magic's history that you have that we don't have on Arena. So I don't think we need to discuss whether this card is good or not. I think the discussion point on this one is like, how does it compete with the other Eternal Witness style effects, especially Timeless Witness, because it's occupying the same mana value and mana cost as that card. So where are you guys at on this versus other Eternal Witness variants, and like what do you guys think of just like the kind of like beating the hammer over the head with this style of effect, like set in, set out?
I love these sort of effects. They're some of my favorite effects in Limited. I do think this one's pretty boring. I don't think it's as interesting as something like a Timeless Witness or an Under the Skin. I think those cards are just substantially more interesting to me personally. But if I'm, and I have the advantage of looking at Daneelius's notes, but even if I didn't have them here, I would guess that the stat line on this being better means that he's going to be more interested in it relative to something like Timeless Witness, where we're more interested in its raw grind power.
Yeah, this one's tough. First of all, I do think Under the Skin is just better. I think Under the Skin is unbelievable. Yeah. It's insane. The fact that you cast it on 3 mana as a cantrip is nuts. However, it's not a permanent, and this is a permanent, and that means that it's easier to chain. Like, for instance, Under the Skin can return this. to me, the question with Timeless Witness, the comparison there, you guys have been using the word like interesting, and the grind power of Timeless Witness is obviously usually going to be better. The reason why I think I prefer this card is I just think this has wider applications. Like I'm just going to play this in my red-green deck, and I don't think I'm playing Timeless Witness in my red-green deck. And so, yes, this is worse in my Sultai grind decks, but do you really need access to the third, the fifth time you activate Timeless Witness in those decks? Aren't you really just kind of looping things in those decks anyways? So I feel, and plus this blocks way better than Timeless Witness, which also matters. So I don't know. I think I prefer this. I'm not like happy about it, and I do think there's a question of like, okay, do you run multiples of these effects? Mm-hmm. It's just what green becomes about at 4 mana. I don't know, but I think I prefer this just because I think it has overall wider applicability. I'd much prefer this in a tempo strategy than Timeless Witness, but I think it's hard to go wrong, is the truth. I think they're both very good cards.
Where does it stack up against Evolution Witness? Because if you're not doing a +1/+1 counter thing, like Evolution Witness is ostensibly 5 mana for what you're getting from this card, though obviously like split up into investments. And Evolution Witness has pretty absurd synergy if you can put additional +1/+1 counters on it. Like, is this like on average better than Evolution Witness, or is that just like super contextual as well?
I think it is. I see Witness as very much a synergy card. It's like almost a combo card. Like there's combos that can really push this power, but the fact that like you can go to activate the adapt on Evolution Witness and they just kill in response and you're really sad. It's like I think you really need to be trying to exploit the synergies pretty hard on Evolution Witness to want to play with it. Though I think it is certainly playable if you have those. But this just what I like about this card is it's just good everywhere. There's no deck I wouldn't play this in. I can't imagine a green deck that wouldn't want to run this card.
It's going to be good no matter what.
I think that's a fair argument, especially in the context of something that's a little more proactive, like red-green or green-white, being more interested in this card and it just being kind of good enough. And also, one of the ways that your green-black deck does die is that you play, your hand's a little anemic. It doesn't quite get the grind loop going fast enough, and your creatures just don't have enough stats. And like a 4/3 is not crazy stat line, but it's going to trade with something most of the time. So that's a fair argument. Like a 2/1 doesn't always trade, right? A 4/3 will pretty much always trade.
Yeah, I mean, we can compare them back and forth between a bunch of different things. I guess my overall question is like, how many of these is just too many of these? And I feel like we're already at the point where we don't want to add another. Even in our 360, we don't want to go up on the number of like Gravediggery type green creatures, because then the whole cube just becomes that Mold Drifter thing again. Yeah. Just in terms of like getting cards back from your graveyard instead of drawing cards from your deck.
Yeah, and to put it into perspective, I mean, people have been commenting. They've mentioned in our cube that green is particularly difficult to, like, if you ever get in a grindy matchup of green, even as a blue control deck, you feel kind of as a dog because you're just never going to run the green deck out of cards.
No. They're going to sift or worm you 5 times.
For me, I'm currently running Under the Skin and Timeless Witness. I think I'm just going to slot this in for Timeless Witness and be a little sad about it because I do really like Timeless Witness, but I just think this card is just going to get played more often. And, but I agree. I don't want to add more.
Yeah.
There's plenty of that. And I also honestly like, recently we added Sticky Tongue, Sentinel, and Rambling Possum to kind of give green access to a different version of that
and I miss Rambling Possum
element. And I think that's like an interesting, that's a cooler way of taking green in terms of its grind potential. So
yeah, I really liked that card.
I mean, we all agree this card's good. This is the type of thing I expect every set to have a new one of these now because of the way they've been designing around that template, and I think Under the Skin really solidified like this is the bar at this point for these sorts of cards, and like everything else is going to be compared to Under the Skin at this point when it comes to these kind of like regrowths on a body. Next up, Sutina, Speaker of the Tajuru, 2 and a green for a 2/2 uncommon legendary elf scout. When Sutina enters, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. I don't think these cards generally put them in your hand. I don't think they've ever put them on the battlefield before. When Sutina attacks, you may return a land you control to its owner's hand. When you do, put a +1 counter on target creature. That's a cool little package. Starting off with 3 mana 2/2 ramp, which is already like a beat above a lot of other cards that do very similar things. Think of like very recently the Lookout, the frog from Bloomburrow was one we discussed, which dug until you hit a basic land, put it in your hand. Even compared to like a Contagious Vorak, which is a 3-mana 3/3 that finds your next land but doesn't put it into play. This is a 3-mana creature that just straight up ramps you, and it's mana fix in, it's ramp. It does a lot of stuff, and then you're not going to bounce a land every single time this attacks. In fact, this isn't even going to attack every single time it can. But with MDFCs and certain landfall cards and combinations of things, discard outlets, there is some utility to being able to bounce your own lands on demand. I've actually seen that with Sticky Tongue Sentinel a couple times, where you'll bounce a land to either give you a mana on a turn where you didn't have a land drop, or to pick up an MDFC that you had to play out early and stuff like that. So that's not nothing text either, but I think we're really falling back on like, this is a Civic Wayfinder that just puts the land into play instead of putting it into your hand, which is a pretty strong improvement over this style of effect.
I remember a lot of people getting excited about the 1/2 reach creature from Bloomburrow, and this feels like the card we wanted that card to be. Like this goes in and it finds us our fixing, right? It can enable our splashes, and then it also does something after it's in play. It's not just a 1/2 we have to blink. I think on the play, this card's also like, I mean, you go like turn 1 Llanowar Elves, turn 2 you play this, turn 3 you probably can attack in some spots. And a lot of times you keep those Llanowar Elf hands because they have the elf, and the number of times I have kept a 2-lander and missed my 3rd land drop out of those kind of hands, trying to get the high roll. I mean, this kind of smooths that out, right? You're getting the land for your next turn, and if you miss that 3rd natural land drop, you get to make it anyway, so you can still just chug right along.
This is a lot of knobs that I like. I like the package of effects here, even if, like, I don't think this card is, like, blowing me away, but there's a lot of little knobs, and, like, the baseline's already good enough. Like, it gives you a +1 counter. I didn't really lean in on that, but you do get to grow a creature when you return a land as well.
Yeah, permanent bonus also works well with your Dromoka guy. Puts a +1 counter on a thing.
I think this card kind of blows me away, to be honest. I mean, I think just the 3-mana 2/2 ramp a basic already being better than every version of that card we've ever seen, it would make it playable. And the fact, I mean, if you go and look at MDFCs, it depends on what you're playing, obviously, but if you go look at MDFCs available in Peasant and how many of them are instants, and you think about like, okay, I'll bounce the sink into super back to my hand, and then bounce your blocker, or
revitalize and repassed.
Yep, or Colony Ambush, or Kazul's Fury, or Fell the Profane. Like, there's a lot of instant speed MDFCs that you can leverage with this. And then if you're, like you said, you could just be playing a landfall deck, or you could just be attacking, and you're just putting a +1/+1 counter on your Double Striker, or on your Heartfire here to give it an extra counter. It's like, I just think that this card is kind of nuts to me in terms of all that it does. Now, the total power output of what it's doing isn't as high as some other cards, and that's why you look at this and you're like, it's never going to take over the game or anything, and that's true, but this is a lot of effect for what you're getting, and I think this package is... I would be surprised if this gets pushed out of a cube for a long time. If I was, using your tagging system, I think I would slap forever on this. I think this is kind of crazy.
Yeah, I would put it closer to test card personally, but I think calling it like a synergy card isn't exactly right, because it's just baseline good. Like, you could put it in any green deck and it's going to be good. Man, green 3s have been like our biggest point of contention, I think, in the Peasant Cube at this point, because they just, ever since we got Jewel Thief, Contagious Vorak, and Eldrazi Reprocessor, now Llanowar Visionary, like green 3s are just so stacked that like every time we play a new one, we're replacing a good card. But that's just the nature of Peasant Cube at this point.
Yeah, I not too far back started I did a video, a Teld Talk video, where I talked about cards that were like little synergy, micro synergy cards that I was really enjoying. And this feels like it would have, if this card had been out, I would have put this in the video. Like, this is a card that has a ton of little things going on that I really like about it. Probably a little bit less in our cube than in some other environments, because we don't really do a lot with landfall. But this card just, I really like the design of it. It's really slick. I think, overall, it's just a really, really nice package. I'm in on it.
Yeah, sweet stuff here. Daneelius, I'm going to let you cover the last green card, because I'm not a believer right now, but you sold me on a different 3-mana 4/2.
I'm not going to try to sell you as hard. Yeah, I'm not going to try to sell you as hard on this one. So this is Eager Truffle Snout. It's 2 and a green for a 4/2 boar with trample. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, create a food token. So this has all the same downsides as Anup, and it has a lot of the same stat line. It has trample, but instead of being able to draw cards on attack, this gets to make food on damage. The only reason why I included this, why I think it's like at least worth a consideration. So I have a lot of cube designers recently have been saying, hey, maybe we have enough food synergies to start pushing like a green-black food package in our cubes. Well, I have done that, and I think it's really strong. I've been very happy with that. I basically I'm using a lot of the food cards I was using anyways, but I brought in Trail of Crumbs and, oh gosh, what's the green-black sweet tooth lady from Wilds of Eldraine? Yep, yeah. And Greta.
Do you have Bone Horde Cache or Bone Cache?
I'm not using. I don't love that one as much, but I could imagine using it. I think it's very understandable. But the point is just I think that the food stuff really works, is enjoyable to draft. It has synergies with any artifact themes that you have. So I've really appreciated having the food package. Now my cube obviously pushes harder into like trinkets and artifacts than some do, so your mileage may vary there. But the fact that this is a card that you theoretically would be happy to play in red green, 4-power matters, just aggro trick stuff, or in a food deck is interesting to me. Ultimately, I do think it's probably too weak, but at this point I'm basically flagging any card that lets me continuously make food tokens because I think that it's potentially worthwhile. But ultimately, I do think all the downsides of ANEP count here, and the upside probably isn't large enough to include.
Okay. I find this a little boring, to be honest, but I also find the upside isn't quite as high, right? We have to deal combat damage, not just attack, and our payoff is way lower, but the risk is the same. I'm all in on this like green-black squirrelsy food thing. Like, I really down for that. I think that's an archetype that we run in the standard cube, and we're talking about doing a synergy cube that we're going to use that as one of the green-black archetypes. It's one of my favorites. It's a cool direction for green-black to go in. That being said, I really don't think this one gets there. And I do have to mention, this was like the third or fourth card when they started spoiling this. Is like, why is this a random uncommon that just dies to Burst Lightning? Like, why is every 3-drop dying to a 1-mana removal spell?
Did make Stab and Burst Lightning very good in this.
Well, this is why I say I just don't really understand what they were thinking when they designed it. It doesn't seem to me like they mailed this one in. I feel like that just really truly doesn't make any sense. But the one other reason why I did tag this card, this is the best version of a green 3-mana 4/2 we've ever seen. Like, I think pretty much bar none. And now that doesn't mean that this is playable, but they're pushing the playability of these cards more and more. And I do think one of these days we will get, if this said enters or attacks, it's in for me probably. It's just it's
sure.
not combat damage is much worse than either of those effects. So.
And same caveat, if you're doing Garruk's Uprising stuff, like this card has more synergy there. 4-power matters on 3. That's where cards like this really shine, is the 4-power payoffs really shine when you have like 2-drops and 3-drops with 4-power. And we don't really do that anymore, but they do print payoffs for that sort of archetype every now and then. That's a very common theme to have for red-green in a limited format. So I agree. Yeah, it's a good Alpine Grizzly as far as Alpine Grizzlies are concerned, but I already expressed my concerns about that with ANEP. And if food does not inherently have any benefit beyond being food, like I'm less excited about it. But yeah, food matters. Like, if you found a way to make food matter, like, sure, I can definitely see it.
I don't know if we're ever surpassing Alpine Grizzly in KTK. That's about as good as Alpine Grizzly's ever been for me, and I think it's probably as good as it's ever gonna be. So I'm not really hopeful for these 4/2 creatures.
At rare, we get things like the Outcaster or whatever it's called, the plot guy.
Sure, and that card's good. That card's fine. I don't actually think that card's
I think it's pretty good.
It's solid. I don't think it's one of those ones that blows me away. It's just kind of like it's a good card.
Okay, so we're moving into reprint territory now. So I think for ourselves we should probably spend like slightly less time talking about the known factor cards here, but like if they're exciting or you think they have like a place in cube, let's talk about them. Obviously, the first one we have to put a little caveat on what we said in the last episode. I think we kind of panned Condemn a little bit for having a mythic rare symbol on it, but they actually announced after we recorded that episode that the special guest cards on Arena are going to have their rarity adjusted to like an appropriate level. So I think Condemn is actually going to be an uncommon on Arena, despite having a mythic rare symbol in paper, which was not something they had announced when we originally recorded for the mainline review episode. So the first card here is Condemn, which presumably will be an uncommon on Arena, so therefore is viable for R Cube. If you go by like actual Peasant Pauper rules or whatever, like anything, Condemn has always been Peasant legal. We just abide by the rarities that are currently on Arena. So I'm not going to get into too many details on that. But Condemn is a single white mana for an instant. Put target attacking creature on the bottom of its owner's library. Its controller gains life equal to its toughness. Just a good defensive white card. Pretty poor in aggro decks, but when you compare to like Elspeth's Smite, and there's even another card in this set called like Joust Through or something like that, like deal 3 damage to an attacking creature for 1 mana. This is probably favorable as a defensive card to just get whatever's attacking you out of the way. And like Elspeth's Smite has the upside of exiling the creature that it kills, but this also just puts a card on the bottom of its owner's library, which is functionally like exiling it for the most part.
Yeah, I think the main concern I have with this, I've moved so much of the attrition cards in my white section to be permanents, to take advantage of things like Essence Reliquary and now Sunblessed Healer. To me, that's just the main consideration here. Is like I'd rather run artifacts and enchantments that interact than spells at this point. It's just kind of the way it is. But I do think this card is solid.
Just Condemn's just a fine removal spell. It's not revolutionary or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually like it here less than I did in the main cube discussion, mostly because I think there's less dedicated control decks, particularly within white. I think this sort of effect is just naturally weaker at Peasant, although I guess your opponent's more likely to be guaranteed to be attacking you, so there's, it's more usable in that case. It's 1 mana. It always kills its man when your opponent attacks, but a lot of Peasant still revolves around these little value engines that aren't attacking. Like, this doesn't kill your opponent's Blood Artist, it doesn't kill your opponent's Rosy Cotton and all that sort of stuff, so you're still losing the game to those cards. So I think this card is just intrinsically a lot weaker at Peasant. It's a fine card, it's cool that it's legal, but I'm not nearly as excited about it here as I was in the mainline review, where I thought it was a very powerful effect.
Understood. Next up we have Angel of Finality, which got a rarity downshift to uncommon. I don't know where Angel of Finality comes from. I assume Avacyn Restored. I know it was in a commander deck, stuff like that. But this is 3 and a white for a 3/4 uncommon angel with flying, and when it enters, exile target player's graveyard. Notably, you can target yourself for your Insidious Roots. I think, so as much as Phantom Monster doesn't stand up like 4 mana 3/3 flyer, I think 4 mana 3/4 flyer is actually a rock solid stat line still. And I view this is what I would call a back pocket card, where it's like, this is doing something very specialized, and it's a good card to have like in the background if you need to solve a problem, and that problem is graveyard based decks. So if you ever have an issue with graveyard-based decks just running rampant, I think Angel Finality is the type of card that you can pull out of your back pocket and say, okay, I've got a tool to kind of deal with that. Kind of like we mentioned with Pyroclasm in the last set, where it's like, okay, if your go wide decks are running rampant, you have Pyroclasm in the back pocket, but you don't necessarily need to play it right now. So I wanted to mention this as a rarity downshift that I think gets there on rate and solves a problem if you deem that to be a problem. But we like to actually see our graveyard decks flourish right now. They do really cool things. They span a lot of different colors. So this isn't something that I would want to put in our cube. But I do think like there might come a time where we're like, okay, the Rise of the Rats deck is just crushing people. What can we do to solve that isn't cut Rise from the Rats? And it's like, oh, Angel Finality is a card that might, do something there.
I don't love that this is such a hammer. That's my big problem with it. Like, I wish it was... I really like running... I've got a card, the Black Zombie Maker from Midnight Hunt, that when it enters... Yep, Diagraph Colossus. Diagraph something, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll get right here. It's Diagraph Horde. Yes, Diagraph Horde. I really like that effect, like targeted graveyard interaction. Making it a hammer like this, I don't love, because basically what it just means is I'm much more likely to use it in really specialized spots, and when I use it, the game ends. And I just feel like that's less, that play pattern isn't something I'm really looking for, unless the card itself is really interesting. But the card itself isn't really interesting. That's really all this does, is just that one thing. Like, at least Diagraph Horde also, gives you all these objects, and it can play different ways. So I think it's fine to run this, and especially, yes, if you're happy to run hammers, if you really need to have access to hammers to keep your graveyard decks in check, I think it's fine. It's not the kind of card I think I'm excited to run.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't really love this for the same reason I don't want to run something like Soul Guide Lantern.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's why we passed on Thraben Charm, right? The instant, it's especially brutal when it's instant speed exile a graveyard, because you usually like 2-for-1 your opponent on top of killing their whole strategy. So again, this would have to require very specific things going on with graveyard decks to even be a consideration. But I mean, I don't know, like the highest power level Peasant cubes you can get, the ones that are playing like Animate Dead and Reanimate and stuff like that. Maybe Angel Finality has a home there now as like a mid-rangey creature that can nuke a graveyard, but I don't really have the expertise to know what those kind of high power Peasant cubes look like, but I bet this is a tool for those. Next up is Night's Whisper, which we were pretty tepid on this for the mainline cube. It sounded like pre-conversation that Daneelius was very high on this for Peasant cube, but Night's Whisper is 1 and a black for a sorcery. At common, you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. Very, very simple and clean card to read. Daneelius, what are you thinking that this is? Like you said to me basically that you think this is like an extremely important card to pick up for Peasant environments.
I mean, important might be. I just think it's the best of what it does. It's just the best of what it does. And if you're supporting kind of spells related archetypes that touch black, I just can't imagine not running this card. Basically, I mean that's really all it is. It's not exciting in that it's just a draw spell. I definitely think the divinations have gotten worse over time, and for that reason, I think spells decks have gotten worse over time. So if you're not supporting spells, then this is obviously not going to be that exciting to you. But yeah, I mean, this would if I had access to this in my card pool, but I don't. It's a jumpstart card, but if I did, it would be a slam dunk include, not very close. Mm-hmm. So I mean, and especially when you take into account again, blue getting both Messenger and Mystic now, that you're getting benefits off of drawing extra cards. I think this is just the best at what it does, and so it's a easy include for that reason, but not particularly exciting.
Do you think it's better than Mortar Muster? 1 in a black, amass 1, draw a card, lose a life?
I do, specifically because in like all right, yeah, I suppose it's an interesting question. I do think Mortar Muster has slightly more broad applicability, but in a spells deck, I definitely would rather have this. I just think draw 2 on a black card is really valuable when you don't have to sacrifice Board Presence, which is really the only way the black has access to that now. That's really the way I think about it. It does something that other black cards don't get to do. You have to play something like Pointed Discussion or 3 mana cards. Really, you just have to play 3 mana cards to get access to that kind of card advantage. So I mean, like I said, I don't think this is exciting. I just think it's the best what it does.
Sure. It's funny that Sign in Blood, the black target player loses 2 life, draw 2 cards is still a rare on Arena, and we're getting this at common, and it's like, okay, I see what y'all did with Sign in Blood. Teld, do you think this actually gets there for our Peasant queue?
We can talk about it. I just don't care about this card. If you want to run it, we can. I think I agree that it's good at what it does. It's just I find what it does is really boring and just doesn't get me. Doesn't do what I want to be doing for Peasant cube. I don't think it's a power level issue here, like I was concerned about in the mainline cube, where I was like, this card's not as good as it used to be. But it's just kind of like, this is like not as. I don't think this is as interesting as something like Village Rites or Eviscerator's Insight that have a little synergy aspect to them. And so I think there's a limit to how many of these effects you can run. It probably should be in the cube. I think it almost certainly should be, just because it's an old card that still definitely holds up, but we'll have to talk about finding a slot for it.
Yeah, I think I'm higher on it than you and Chris. I think when I talk about like cards being uninteresting, I'm always gravitating towards like owlbears, but for some reason I don't care as much when it's just like card draw. Like I don't need my card draw to be like super interesting. Though I do think like an Eviscerator's Insight type card is certainly more interesting, whatever that word means. We throw it around a lot without actually defining what we mean by an interesting card, but I think people kind of get it.
One of the key things, real quickly, the reason why blue divinations are worse and worse over time is that blue just doesn't have access to cheap interaction to pair with those card or spells. Black does. Black is the color of cheap interaction.
True,
that's why Night's Whisper is so good, is that you go Night's Whisper into Cutdown, or Night's Whisper, into whatever your 2-mana Doomblade effect is, and that makes it a lot better of a effect for black specifically.
Yeah. Burst Lightning is single red mana for an instant with Kicker 4. It deals 2 damage to any target, and if you kicked it, it deals 4 damage instead. We actually played Shock in the mainline cube, so this was like just a direct upgrade to Shock, but we don't actually have Shock in our Peasant cube, so like we'll have to find a less comparable card to compare it to. Maybe it's just like Play with Fire. Like the upside on Play with Fire is minor in my opinion. But Burst Lightning's a nice little card. I mean, shocks are still pretty good. Daneelius, you mentioned like with the 4/2s, it's like the power of those 4/2s often comes down to like how good the 1 mana and to some extent 2 mana interaction is. And Burst Lightning is the type of card that makes those 4/2s look a lot worse, you know? So it shocks in general, stabs in general, disfigures, cards like that are going to make those 3 mana 4/2s significantly worse. If you're overloaded on them, a couple shocks here and there, you might bypass them. But Burst Lightning's nice. It's just, it goes to face, unlike Shivan Fire from Dominaria. It can upgrade to kill like a 4-mana creature at some point, which is a nice upgrade to your shock, which you're using to try and pave the early game. I'm talking a lot about Burst Lightning. People know how good this card is.
It does matter a lot, I think, for Arena keepers specifically, because there's just been a lack of face burn for Arena Peasant environments. And this is one of the best ones. And, we talked before about green having this, or Sultai decks getting this kind of graveyard loop block thing going. The way for red decks to deal with that is to have reach. And this is one of the best reach cards, I think, that exists for Peasant, period. And so getting it on Arena is huge.
Yeah, not too much else we have to say about Burst Lightning. It's just a good removal spell, which brings us to a pretty good counter spell. It's funny to talk about Remand because of the existence of Reprieve, but we missed this one. Yeah, we missed this one in the mainline cube. I kind of forgot that it was in the set because there's 700 cards to sift through, and I probably missed a couple others as well. But Remand is being reprinted here. It's 1 in a blue for an uncommon instant. Counter target spell. If the spell was countered this way, put it into its owner's hand instead of into their graveyard, and it cantrips. You draw a card. So Remand's a classic kind of tempo spell. Like, you really want to be putting pressure on your opponent to make the most of it, which is why Reprieve is so powerful. I know people say like Rosy Cotton right now is the best white card in our cube. I actually honestly think Reprieve is the best white card in the Peasant cube, in our Peasant cube right now. I think it's just so good how good Reprieve is for a deck that often pushes damage. But Remand's still good. Like, even if you have to fire Remand off in a control deck, it's functional. It's fine. You're just not capitalizing on it as much. But if you're any sort of like blue tempo deck, Remand's just fantastic. Reprieve is better, obviously, because it's in a color that has, it's in a color that doesn't have like equivalent effects, and it's in a color that's aggressive more often. But Remand's still a good card. I think you'll play it in like almost every blue deck, but you want to capitalize on it by attacking.
I think it's the best
opponent.
Blue card now on Arena for Peasant immediately for the same reasons. Reprieve,
you think the best blue card?
The best for Peasant specifically on Arena. I think Reprieve is better for the reasons you said. I don't think it really matters though. Remand is still insane. It's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna take points away from Remand because Reprieve exists. I think it's quite good. I don't know if I would say it's the best blue card, but I also haven't really thought about it. I don't know off the top of my head what I would say the best blue card for Peasant Cube is. So I'm not going to argue with you there.
I still hold my general view that I think the threats tend to be a little better than the interaction, but I do agree this card is a good pickup. I think it's a rock solid card, great pickup. It'll be a good tempo card, and you'll play in your control decks as well. And I do think I will argue. I think that these Reprieve sort of effects I think are slightly worse at Peasant than they are in the mainline cube, because the mainline cube features more like table flippy kind of cards that you can bounce back and then you've got the pressure to instantly win the game. But the more streamlined and aggressive that Peasant cube gets, I think the better this sort of effect obviously gets.
Mm-hmm. You know what I'm excited to do with this card is bounce my own adventures back to my hand and use this on my own adventures to kind of loop through my adventures again.
Yeah, but bounce your own spell to beat your opponent's counterspell.
Yeah, there's that. Like, you don't see that with Reprieve because in the white decks you're often aggressive, right? So Reprieve is just going to bounce your opponent's interaction back or their like stabilizing threat back. But with Remand, you actually do see it quite often where you get in either counter wars or you're in a position where you care about casting spells where you'll just remand your own like cheap spell back to your hand to get another spell in the stack and cantrip. So there's like some implication. You can do all of that with Reprieve, right? Like you can do that. You just end up not doing that because of the way the white decks play out. So a little bit of extra reach for Remand there.
I'm excited to pass the turn with Canyon Crab to loot, making a token off of my Mystic or Messenger. Then on their turn, they go to remove my Mystic, remand it back to their hand to draw a card, and to consider to make another token. And I think it's going to very excited.
Sure.
Yeah, this is a nice one. Okay, I think Daneelius mentioned excitement about the next one here, so I'll let you read.
Well, excitement might be strong, but yes. So this is Triplicate Spirits, OG limited card, 4 white for a sorcery. It has Convoke and put 3 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying onto the battlefield. So I think that Convoke has gotten significantly worse over time because having untapped creatures in play going into your attack step on your turn is actually really important in Modern Magic, and especially with white decks. So compared to when was this, M15 when this originally came out, and it was much easier for you to just kind of take the turn off to build up a huge board of flyers. This has certainly gotten a lot worse. Really, I'm just thinking about this in the context of white being this color that just vomits out tokens all over the battlefield with Release the Dogs and Hop to It and Battle Screech and everything else. This, to me, feels like a card you could very easily include to continue pushing into that strategy, or it's a card you could play instead of one of those cards if you feel like those cards are too strong. So for that reason, I think this is relevant. But yeah, I don't think it's a card that you need to play. I don't think it's like I don't think it's better than any of those other options. I think this is probably worse actually than those 3 other token making sorceries. But it's interesting in light of those cards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think it does need to be mentioned too that if I recall correctly, this was the best common by a lot in the format that this was.
It was
played in. Yeah, I mean, so like, while a lot of time has passed, you can't really overlook a card like this. We found Battle Screech to be overpowered and oppressive. We knew Lingering Souls is overpowered and oppressive. And while this is not as good as those cards, it is in kind of the same sort of conversation as those cards.
Yeah, it's mix and match how you please. I think this is a way more fair Battle Screech, if Battle Screech is just, I think, a highly oppressive card in some versions of Peasant Cubes, and Triplicate Spirits isn't oppressive. I would never classify it as that. So mix and match as you please with all these token makers. Like we also talked about a 6 mana creature that makes 3 creatures on board. There's a lot, like Imperial Oath. Like obviously Triplicate Spirits never cost 6 mana, but there's so many ways to just dump a bunch of tokens on board with 1 card in white that like you just take your pick of your favorites. I think Triplicate Spirits, again, to use the word, when I say a card is more interesting, that's kind of shorthand for it has more words on it. And Convoke is like, it's fun, whether good or not, it is fun to play with it. I know we mentioned this card, and at least 1 or 2 people in our Discord were like, oh, Triplicate Spirits, I love that card. And so like it has a little bit of not even, I mean, can you have nostalgia for a card from M15? Like, not really, but you know what I mean, right? Like,
I usually would say interesting for me is like there's a hoop to jump through to get your reward. I tend to like that a lot, is when, the card's like does the same thing as something else, but you have to do a little work to get it.
It makes you fiddle with something else. Like it makes you like physically touch another card somehow and do something like that's kind of what I mean when I'm saying interesting. Like, as opposed to Hop to It puts 3 1/1s on board. This is Hop to It, but it lets you fiddle around with other cards. So next one, I'm not sure what your excitement level on this. I don't really love this card in particular, but Moan of the Unhallowed is reprinted here. It's 2 black for an uncommon sorcery. It makes 2 black zombie creature tokens, and it has flashback for 7, 5 black. And I believe Daneelius, you added this one as well.
Yeah, I have a lot of excitement for this card. I haven't seen much excitement for this, and it's kind of, I mean, I understand because number 1, it's old, and number 2, that flashback cost is high. For me, I compare this to Rise of the Ants, which is a card I still am a big fan of in green. Obviously, that card gains life as well, but the life gain is kind of minuscule. I think this does a pretty good Rise of the Ants impression in black for a cheaper mana cost. This card, in any limited environment it has ever been in, is one of the best non-rares, if not the best non-rare. I think people just kind of forget about that because it's not flashy. It's just like, yeah, you make a bunch of 2/2s. But the fact that, again, you can, in your mill decks, in your Revenge of the Rats decks, this is just a card that you get to put in your graveyard and eventually get value from. If you're playing a cube where that is very high tempo and you just can never imagine tapping 7 mana to do something other than win the game, then okay, this is not going to work there. But even in my cube, which is fairly tempo oriented, I'm flashing back Revenge of the is it Rise of the Ants? I'm doing that in my cube. So I have a hard time. I run currently in my cube the Lord of the Rings Lord. It's like a 3/3 that has a mass 1, and your tokens get Death Touch. I'm definitely considering putting this in over that card. And yeah, I think it's really solid and worth considering for Peasant environments that aren't just the most powerful all cards available to you from all time.
Yeah, this card is a pre-Data era card, but everybody who's played the formats where it was at, I believe it was it the original Innistrad or was it Dark Ascension? This was it.
It was the original Innistrad, I think.
Yeah, and this card was very good. I kind of agree that I think this card is probably going under the radar because the front side just looks like a bunch of bad white cards. We get the 4 mana 2/2 make a 2/2 in every set, and it's always just kind of whatever. It's usually actually pretty decent, to be honest. It's sometimes white's best common or red's best common. We've seen it a couple of times. But this card's like, it is rock solid, and the flashback looks expensive, but if you're playing an attrition deck where you're trying to go long, or you're playing like a Rakdos deck where you just really care about being able to get enough bodies to kill your opponent through non-combat means, this is good. I think the fact that we're currently on Rictus Robber, and that card has not been very good, means that I'm definitely down to try this and see how it pans out. I would not be surprised if it's very good in our cube, though. And I love flashback. I slap flashback on a card, and it's not hard to sell me on it.
Yeah, maybe I need to respect the card a little bit more. I did not play original Innistrad block, but I understand the card was good there. My only experience with this card, I think, was in, I want to say, Ultimate Masters, where it was an uncommon, and like I don't remember the format at all because it's just one of those like mushy-wushy master sets that all blend together. But yeah, okay, I'm sold. I'm sold as a test card, at least from my perspective, and you guys think it's going to be like just a good role player. The first thing that came to mind was Geese's Bidden, which is the Madness card that makes 2/2/2s, which is the same card up front. I believe it's 2 black to make 2/2/2s, and then you can Madness it for like 3 mana or something like that. So like the flashback plus the Madness is like different dynamics. But I could be sold on this. Maybe I'll go back and reconsider it. Next up, the King is back. Pelakka Worm. 4 green, 7 mana total for a 7/7 uncommon worm with trample. When it enters, you gain 7 life, and when it dies, you draw a card. So the main reason I want to mention this is because this card by itself was part of the reason that we originally started going with the rarity restrictions that we did on the Arena client, because this card has only ever been a rare on Arena. In fact, I believe when it was printed in M19, that was the only time it had ever been a rare, period. It had always been an uncommon before that. But because of how Peasant rarity works, like you could technically play Pelakka Worm since it was uncommon at one point, but it still charged our players a rare wild card on Arena. So we just chose to stick to Arena rarities. But here it is at uncommon, so it is a consideration. But I do have to ask, like, where does it stack up against Sifter Worm? Sifter Worm has been in our cube since day one and has never left. It's 7 mana, 7/7, scry 3 when it enters, and then gain life equal to the top card, the mana value of the top card of your library. So, I mean, you get less life on ETB, but you kind of stack your deck instead of drawing a card when it dies. They're very close. They're very close. So, like, I don't know if you guys have an opinion on Pelakka Worm versus Sifter Worm. I know, Daneelius, you're not like super high on 7 drops as it is. But I do think Pelakka Worm is like kind of pseudo-classic and would have been in our cube already if it weren't a rare up until this point.
Well, if you thought people casting Sifter Worm 5 times per game was bad, let's wait till they gain 35 life doing that. I actually think Sifter Worm is probably a better card, TBH. I think the immediate impact of Scry 3 is often enough to really get there, but like this card gains a ridiculous amount of life to the point that it's very, very difficult to die, even if the dies draw card is probably worse than ETB Scry 3.
Yeah, card's great. I have no idea if it's better or worse than Sifter Worm. I have this is what I want out of my 7 mana, so I think it's curator's choice. If you have 2 slots, I'd run these 2 over any of the others. Well, Howling Giant I do think is a tough choice there. I do like Howling Giant a lot as an army in a can, so I don't know. There are lots of great 7-drop options for green. I have a hard time picking one over the other.
Yeah. I guess just a long and short, I think I would advocate to try this out over Sifter Worm just because Sifter Worm has been in our cube for 5 years. That said, let's go ahead and blow through a couple more reprints. We're running low on time, folks. We're running low on time. Banisher Priest is reprinted here. 1 white for a 2/2 uncommon human cleric. When it enters, exile target creature an opponent controls until Banisher Priest leaves the battlefield. So we've seen this effect iterated on a bunch of times. This was actually the original one that kind of like re-templated Fiend Hunter and kind of gave us the like template of the, one trigger instead of 2 triggers.
Yeah. Worse than Fiend Hunter, worse than Fairground Warden, worse than 8X Sentry. That's all I'm saying.
I personally hate these sorts of effects. Like, I don't even like Annex Sentry. I know people like it, but I strongly dislike like 3 and 4 drop Banisher Priest style cards because it's just so easy to answer them when they have frail bodies, and then you have these blowouts mid combat and stuff like that. So, Daneelius, did you add this one as something to talk about?
Just that I think they're better than all the other 3 drops. So you could have a cube where you just have nothing but these effects of 3, and if you're just based on power level, it's kind of hard to not do that. But yeah, it's uninteresting and worse than other options. But it's still insane. So.
Now that would be cool. A cube full of nothing but Banisher Priests where they're all just constantly exiling each other. Relief Captain up next. This is 2 white for a uncommon Core Knight ally. It's a 3/2, and when it enters, you support 3, which means you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 3 other target creatures. I want to say this was from Oath of the Gatewatch, and the immediate comparison for us is Airy Auxiliary, which is the 4 mana 3/3 that essentially has support 2. You can put 2 +1 counters on each of up to 2 target creatures. Where do you think that comparison comes down? You're giving up flying essentially to get an extra +1/+1 counter on another creature.
I think that the white on this makes it worse. If not for the white, I think they basically do the exact same, and it's just kind of a dealer's choice situation. The one specific reason why I think this matters is Hop to It into this is better at protecting your board against effects like Fear Fire Foes, and so I think that's like relevant. But I really do think it's mostly dealer's choice. I tend to avoid white or 2 color pips in my cards when I can if there's good other options. So I probably won't make the switch, but I think it's reasonable.
That's fair. Airy Auxiliary is a hell of a card.
I like Airy Auxiliary better. I think the flying is really, really relevant at making the body itself threatening. I agree with this is better at protecting your board. This is better if you've gone super wide and your curve is doing the thing. But I think Airy Auxiliary has the ability to make your less powerful hands be really good, which I think is something I'm looking for. I'm looking for the consistency of just putting a good threat into play and then pumping my board.
Another card I wanted to mention here in the same line as Angel of Finality. We have Dryad Militant seeing a reprint here, and they gave it, looks like they gave it art that was not done by a problematic human being, but it's a hybrid green-white mana for a 2/1 uncommon Dryad Soldier. So 1 mana 2/1, kind of Savannah Lions, obviously. And it says if an instant or sorcery card would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So again, graveyard hate, but specifically geared towards like the spell-based deck. So back pocket card, like through and through, just a back pocket card. If you have aggressive green-white decks, which Dryad Militants and Savannah Lions, and those aren't that good, but they're still functional, and you have a need to like try and shut down your opponent's like, I don't know, Rise from the Tide decks or something like that, you could consider Dryad Militant as like a Selesnya hybrid card with some flexibility. You would have to have some really degenerate spell-based decks before this is something you would consider. And even then, like, they just shock this most of the time. So
I do like intentionally seeding hybrid cards into my cube. So that's the main thing about this that's exciting is the hybridness of it. But I agree. Otherwise, it's kind of whatever.
Also does nerf your instants and sorceries, which I can't see mattering too much for green and or white decks, but it is worth noting it's symmetrical.
Yeah, art's worse than the original, and the card hasn't aged particularly well. I'm good passing on this one.
Yeah. Vampire Nighthawk, that's a cool one. It's 1 black for a 2/3 uncommon Vampire Shaman. It has Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink, like the original uncommon keyword soup creature. I don't love it, but it's, as far as like rocky mid-range 3-drops go, like you can just put this in a black deck and it'll be fine, if not just good.
I included this specifically because I'm in some other Peasant discords, and we kind of keep a track of all of the different lists, and we can see like what cards are most played and less played, and this is one of the most played cards out of all these cubes. I haven't had access to it, so I haven't been able to run it, but I'm told by folks that it still stands up. I'm a little bit skeptical, but I don't know. It has a lot of words on it and a lot of abilities, so I can see it. I really don't have a strong opinion on it. It was unbelievable in Zendikar, like the best card in the format, basically in Zendikar. So again, I think it comes down largely to what does your removal suite look like? How many 1-mana ways do you have of interacting with it? The more of those you have, the worse this gets.
Well, I also think one thing to remember about Zendikar, if you didn't play that format, is that format was the first, or not, maybe not the first, but it's one of the original, like, oh my god, this is all aggro all the time formats. And there were so many. There was like Vampire Lacerator running around as like a 2/2 for 1, and there was just a bunch of creatures that could not attack into Vampire Nighthawk, and it raced them. So like it was partly contextual. I think the stat lines are such that now Vampire Nighthawk isn't quite the roadblock that it used to be, even against aggro decks. I mean, that being said, I would not be surprised if it holds up. It's got a bunch of keywords on it, gains you life. But I mean, it is also a 3-mana card that dies to cut down. So like that is always something that if your opponent has the cheap way to kill this, you get no value and you lose tempo, and that's a great way to lose a game of Magic. So I would not be surprised if let's get the counter up. If this is a polar card where if your opponent is playing aggressive and they don't have the interaction piece for it, it's very good. And if they're playing a less aggressive deck or they have the cheap way to get it off the table, it's probably quite bad.
Yeah, 1 black's also a little rough. Worth noting, Flying Death Touch or Reach Death Touch, that combination of abilities will always guarantee that this trades at least 1-for-1 with a card. Maybe there's sometimes you get like your opponent 2-for-1s you with like a Flame Tenkavu or something, but it always demands that a card or an ability like get this off the battlefield. Otherwise, it just trades for a creature. So I can't see a world where Vampire Nighthawk is like the best card in any black deck, especially given how synergy driven Peasant Cube tends to be. But I also don't really see it being like the worst card in your deck most of the time. Just like a fine card to spend 3 mana on. Which just closes out with one more kind of very simple card here. Ash Barrens. I correct me if I'm wrong. I think this is the first time Ash Barrens is on Arena. I can't recall a different reason they would have put this on Arena. But Ash Barrens is a common land that taps for colorless mana and has basic land cycle in for 1. So you can discard it, pay 1, and go fetch up a basic land, put it into your hand. So very functionally similar to an Evolving Wilds in what it's trying to do. You pay a mana to kind of fix your mana. And you got a good point here, Daneelius, that like Evolving Wilds has micro synergies. It's usually not like a super important synergy, but it has micro synergies with things like landfall and sacrifice and filling up your graveyard. Ash Barrens has micro synergies with discarding, basically, is it. So I guess if you're in the world where what was that?
It's the same thing for filling up your graveyard.
Yeah. That's I realized that after I said it. It puts a card in your graveyard, so it's easy to do that. It comes down to discard synergy. It's like
I think the biggest thing this card has, and this is something that isn't going to come up every game, but you could just play this for 1 mana. Like if your colors are fixed, this is just way better because you just get to like play your untapped lane. So I
you
think
can
this
actually
is, like,
just play it.
Yeah, I'm not going to say this is strictly better, but I think it's close to strictly better, especially in a world where we have the landscapes already giving us 10 fetch effects.
Yeah, I guess that's something that's really important, is that you can just play it and tap it for mana too. I really don't see a reason to play it though. Like if you're on Evolving Wilds already, or I guess you would be on like Escape Tunnel at this point, right? Because Escape Tunnel is just a strictly better Evolving Wilds. Like maybe you could consider this instead as like a land that you can play and tap for mana right away. But I think I'm really not that interested unless I do have Delirium or Containment Construct, and even with Delirium, like Evolving Wilds is going to function very similarly. So,
well, we may have forgotten, but did you know we actually run Containment Construct in our Peasant Cube?
Apparently, we do. Yeah, so maybe that's like enough of a push to play this over like an Evolving Wilds variant, though. I don't think we're actually on Evolving Wilds at the moment. Okay, that kind of closes out everything. A lot of reprints there at the end. We're not going to spend too much time kind of parsing out how the reprints play, given that people have probably been playing with them for 10 plus years at this point. But closing thoughts, like we talked about actually quite a bit here in terms of new stuff. There was obviously Jumpstart to toss in a bunch of really interesting legendary creatures as well across the like 2 and 3 mana slots. So there was a lot more to talk about than if it was just the mainline set. But I mean, are you like, what's the coming out of the other end of this review? What's the excitement level for Peasant Cubes? Like a lot that you're excited to try out, or just a few things here and there that you're happy about? Like where are you guys at?
Yeah, it was a good bit. I think there's a lot here. The genericness of the cards makes them actually kind of good for cube in a way, because they're not super narrow where you have to have a specific type of cube. They're just cards that if they meet what your cube is trying to do, then you get a lot of good value here. I think there's a lot of interesting white cards in particular that I thought were pretty cool. Yeah, I'm interested to see if some of these cards that we think are going to be, that we're a little on the fence about, end up playing out well. Yeah, Yeah, overall decent set. I mean, I'm not really excited to play limited in it. I'll probably draft it like 5 times and move on with life. But as you said, it's a palette cleanser. It's a very easy to parse through set as to what the cards are going to do. So yeah.
I think if you have access to all these cards, which unfortunately I don't, but if you do for your cubes, especially if you're an arena keeper, I think this is actually a pretty exciting set. I really like the Jumpstart Legends. I think they're doing really interesting things. I like that they're not all slam dunk includes, and you actually have to really think about you pushing the synergies, whether you're pushing them enough, whether you want to push them more to enable them. I prefer if we got more cards like that as opposed to cards that are like, oh well, this is just a much better version of the previous thing we had, so I guess we're playing it. So I really appreciate the full set that they gave us here, and I think that Sunblessed Healer and Cat Collector are amazing. And I already have a feeling that white might be the best color in Peasant, or one of the top 2, and this just continues to push that in that direction. So yeah, I think good overall, good package.
Yeah. Any favorite card to close out with? Anything?
Cat Collector, easily.
Okay, cat, just clocking in Cat Collector. Mine, yep. Wriggling Grub. I'm all about that grub. I'm ready to make 3. I'm ready to make people miserable with Unearth and just make 6 bodies for 2 mana.
Yeah, I also think the Cat Collector is very cool. But I will say, after talking about it, I'm really interested to see if Inep pans out. And also, I'm pretty unreasonably excited about Satina. I think that card is very slick design. So those are the ones I'm really into.
Sweet. Well, let's go ahead and close out there. Thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us. Give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, especially with a new Retail Limited set coming out right around the corner. By the time you're listening to this, I think Foundations will already be out. Come talk about all things Magic in the Discord. Think of it like your online LGS, and you can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast. We have scheduled events 4 days throughout the week. We have our mainline cube on Sunday and Wednesday nights. Our Peasant cube, which was basically what we were talking about for the majority of this episode, we draft that on Saturday nights. We have F&M style drafts on Friday nights where our players vote on a cube to play, and we have various Jank Diver cubes and user-submitted guest cubes on Saturday and Sunday mornings, which we got to get yours back in rotation. It's always fun to play yours because you have a different dynamic. Even though there's a lot of overlap, there's just a different dynamic, and we always get cool, fresh ideas coming out of that. So let's get that back on the schedule at some point. As always, you can check out our socials. Find us on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, youtube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld on twitch.tv/TeldTalks. Also on YouTube at, I believe, just Teld Talks, TELD Talks. You can find Daneelius floating around a bunch of different Discord servers, like the Jank Diver Gaming Discord server, but also the Limited Level Up server, where I believe he is a moderator. So don't say anything bad or he'll ban you. As far as the listener goes, our next episode is the big rant episode that Chris, myself, and Teld did about the Universes Beyond announcements and the upcoming year of Standard 2025. So we've already had that one recorded for quite a while. I wouldn't say we're excited to get it out, but we felt like there was a lot to express on that episode. So it's maybe a little bit more pessimistic than our usual content, but we also thought it was very important to express our opinions about what's going on in Magic. So that's going to be the next episode. And then I believe it's going to be Pioneer Masters into end of year review. So we'll see what happens for the remainder of 2025, but or 2024 rather. Daneelius, thanks for joining us. It's good to actually have a discussion with you that other people are going to hear. Hopefully we pause these episodes.
Hopefully,
and
no jinxing.
There's content there, but yeah, the lost episode will remain lost to time, and it's good to have you here with some extra opinions about different stuff. I think there's cards here that we talked about and we'll consider that we might not have if you weren't here, so it's good to have that third voice in the room sometimes.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun. Hope to do it again.
Yeah, and everybody at home, thanks for listening, and we will catch you all next time. Announcing Magic the Gathering Foundations. With this set, we're going back to basics, getting in touch with the things that made Magic players fall in love with the game in the first place. You'll see tons of iconic fan favorites here, like Savannah Lions, Sarah Angel, Shivan Dragon, and Hidetsugu's Second Right? Just read the script, damn it. Okay. Hidetsugu's second right. Sure. Experience beginner-friendly limited gameplay with vanilla tutus, cat synergies, and overrun. That's right, we've powered down the limited environment, but decided now was the time to bring back overrun. Don't worry though, green is pretty bad. To make Foundations Limited better for new players, we've stripped the set down to just the basic core elements you'd expect from a draftable format. We've moved away from complexity and wordy mechanics in favor of straightforward creatures, pump spells, and interaction. Stab and Burst Lightning will kill about 90% of the threats in the format, and we've made sure green can't kill anything effectively. We also wanted to keep that wow factor you expect from recent limited sets, so we've crafted an astronomically large delta between the best rares and the ones you'll probably open in your day one sealed pools. Opponent opened a Liliana Dreadhorde General in Alesha? Don't worry about it. Craft a winning strategy with Progenitus and your 2 copies of Brass's Bounty and take them down. Oh, and there's an infinite combo featuring a common creature too. So much to enjoy with Foundations. We've recently heard that new players struggle with the draft portion too, so we've stripped that down to its basics as well. Don't worry about making meaningful decisions beyond the first 2 or 3 picks of the draft. Just take a couple powerful cards to start off with, lock into a color pair, and just pray and hope you pick the right one. We've eliminated cross-color pair synergies, so players will have an easier time recognizing what cards they're supposed to be taking. We also wanted to eliminate any extraneous decision-making during gameplay, so we've removed almost all sources of card draw and filtering. You know those basic land cyclers we've been throwing into just about every set? They would probably be more at home in Foundations than they were anywhere else, but we've removed them to cut back on thought-intensive turns. Just play with the cards you draw and hope you don't get paired against a blue deck with card draw. Mana fixing won't be an issue either, because there really isn't any of it. We printed Campus Guide and Burnished Heart as a clear sign to dissuade people from trying to splash in this format, and we made the drop rate on the 2-color dual lands low too. We also thought it'd be fun to make one of the gain lands significantly better than the others by giving it to a deck with life gain synergies. And for those of you looking to play quick games on the ladder to play as much arena as you possibly can, great news! We've brought heroic reinforcements back to finish out games in a jiffy. So, if you're interested in bare bones, thought-light, prescriptive limited magic with an inflexible draft environment and a clear power disparity between the top 20 to 30 cards in the set and literally everything else, we recommend giving Foundations a try. Wait, is that seriously a new Niv Mizzet? Why are we printing another new Niv Mizzet?
Mind your own fucking business, that's why.